Welcome back, everyone. This is your host, the DN WhatIf, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of what if Deku proved Aizawa wrong? A special shout out to the original creator, ItsClydeBitches. This is the permission statement by the author in written. Please make sure to show your support by checking out their work from the description. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. You straight up lied to them, Shoyuta. Toshi had another one of those idiotic grins on his face, fairly vibrating with accusatory amusement as he leaned on the back of the staff room couch. Aizawa continued drinking his coffee in silence, giving Toshi the same amount of attention he'd give to a worm. Which was to say, none. Worms were a whole lot less persistent though. I didn't lie, Aizawa finally said. He deliberately pulled the paper he was reading a little closer to his face. I changed my mind. And didn't tell the kids. They didn't need to know. Toshi just shook his head, indicating that he knew this conversation was a losing battle. Maybe he'd leave. Except, damn it, you've never changed your mind. Toshi came around to stand with hands on his hips, the iconic all-might pose that, to be frank, wasn't nearly as intimidating in this body. Aizawa resisted the urge to roll his eyes. You've taught here how many years now? 6? And during that time you've accumulated 154 expulsions? Somehow Toshi's tone managed to mix astonishment, awe, and disappointment all into one. You always expel at least one student during the first examination and usually half the class by day 3. Your standards are legendary. Hizashi says it's because you don't want the workload of teaching a full class. But I think you saw something. There was a twinkle in Toshi's eyes that Aizawa didn't like. What it is about this class, Go somewhere else if you want to play at being friends. Aizawa said it to the kids every year. Didn't matter if he walked in on small talk or an all-out brawl. He always dissuaded them from being kind to one another, just to see who had the guts to throw it back in his face. Because raw talent he could work with. Those with battle quirks and pure power at their fingertips could be taught a certain level of morality, a code that would carry them on to being decent, resourceful heroes of the streets, the foot soldiers who helped keep the tide at bay. But true heroes? Those with the level of self-sacrifice needed to make real change in the world? Those were rare. Aizawa wasn't one of them. He just learned to spot their type. This year's entrance exam held only 2 with that spark in them. The girl with the gravity quirk was one of them, though Aizawa had been on the fence about her at first. Would she have run if she hadn't been trapped? Saved the boy if he hadn't saved her first? It was muddled, and that spark hadn't shined until he'd heard about her request to transfer some of her points, the first in UA's history. And the Midoriya boy. No hesitation. No regret. Aizawa saw pro heroes nightly with less steel in their spines and grit in their teeth. He'd watched the exam tape with a manic grin on his face, a grin that only grew when he'd recognized Midoriya from the fight against the sludge villain months ago. Oh yes, he had plans for this boy, right up until he'd seen how the boy's power had shattered his body. Disappointment had a bitter taste. It wasn't an issue of Midoriya's control, but his persistence. Quirks developed young, and any child who'd had years to master the toll a quirk took on his body, or at least lessen the impact into something manageable, and didn't possess the level of dedication needed to become a pro hero. It didn't matter how pure his intentions were. Hell, maybe his attack on the arena trap had just been a fluke. Either way, Midoriya was useless to him. Zero potential. Which made his first day at UA so interesting. What kind of lazy child pushed through a test he had no chance of passing? Since when did the inept display strategic thinking that rivaled Aizawa's own? That little trick with the softball, fucking hell. Midoriya was like a spark discovering his quirk. So Aizawa had to be sure. Shoyuta? Toshi was blinking down at him, looking a little worried about how long he'd been quiet. Honestly. Aizawa stood, yawning in his face and tossing the paper he'd been reading at his scrawny chest. Toshi fumbled before managing to catch it. Midoriya's file? He asked, shoulders hunching. Why? I didn't know quirks could develop so late, Aizawa murmured, reaching out to flick the paper and watching Toshi stiffen. Turns out the kid only registered it a few weeks ago. Odd, isn't it? Toshi visibly swallowed. Why, but I can work with a late bloomer. A class is only as strong as its weakest link, and the Midoriya boy has potential. It wouldn't be rational to expel them. Toshi honestly looked surprised at that, and Aizawa let him, shuffling out of the lounge without looking back. Let the great All Might keep his secrets. Aizawa had plenty of his own. Power, intellect, the heart of a hero. He said every year that a student's potential could drop to 0 at any time. While that remained true, Aizawa had the sneaking suspicion that this year's group would only continue to rise. He hoped they would, that they'd fully embody their motto of plus ultra. Overcome every obstacle, even if that obstacle was their own teacher. Aizawa wanted them to crush him. But they didn't need to know that. 2 weeks into their first semester, Aizawa-sensei came into class with a small, plastic jar. He set it on the edge of his desk while 20 students watched him closely. "You're a part of a team now," he said, eyes drooping. "Whether you want to be or not. Working for agencies, fighting on the streets, it doesn't matter. Your actions affect other heroes around you and vice versa. Get used to it?" Aizawa paused, running a hand through his hair. "From here on out, any unexcused disruptions will result in a marble going into this jar." He held up a small bag for emphasis. "At the end of the day, the whole class will receive 10 minutes of detention for every marble." There was a beat of silence. Then everyone started yelling at once. "Your fault." Kirishima could just be heard over the din. He leaned across his desk to jab Bakugo with a hardened finger. "If you hadn't blown up Midoriya's desk yesterday?" "Shut up. The scum deserved it." Izuku really wasn't sure how that could be, considering all he'd done was drop a pencil, but even that was enough to set Kaken off these last few weeks, ever since he discovered that Izuku had been lying about his quirk. Now all Izuku could do was slide slowly down into his seat and pray to any amiable gods that Kaken didn't turn his temper this way. "Sensei." Ida was half out of the chair, his hand was so high. "Permission to ask a question?" Aizawa blinked. "That was a question." "What is it?" "Yes, sir. I understand the intent behind this exercise, to encourage our sense of responsibility and teamwork. However, those lessons become moot if one party truly does not care about repercussions, or how their actions might impact those around him." Ida's eyes slide to Bakugo. He only got a sneer for his trouble. "As class rep, I must insist that this is grossly unfair." "Life isn't fair," Aizawa said, leaving Ida with his mouth hanging around his knees. "Next, Tokoyami?" He slowly lowered his own hand, considering. "But won't this impact you too, sensei? The more detention you hand out, the longer you'll have to supervise us." Aizawa's grin, when it came, was slow and a little manic. Those in the front row reared back. "Better, but I'll just sleep." "Anyone else?" No one dared ask another question. Uraraka and Azui exchanged worried glances. Todoroki let out quiet tsk in the back of the class. The silence was broken by the sound of a marble hitting a plastic base. "For wasting the first 10 minutes, Aizawa said, and everyone groaned. "Now, turn to page 85. Of course, that marble wasn't alone for long. Within half an hour, Bakugo had secured it a friend by kicking Kaminari's chair out from under him when he'd been balancing on 2 legs, too close for Bakugo's liking apparently, fire and electricity creating a potent mix. By lunch he'd secured them 5 more, mostly for rude comments and small explosions out of boredom. By mid-afternoon there was a rather impressive collection and everyone's nerves were on edge. When Bakugo blew up the jar itself, Aizawa just calmly retrieved another he'd had stashed away. He filled it up twice as high. "I'm going to kill him," Jiro whispered, shaking so hard that her earjacks swayed. "He's just doing it on purpose now." Izuku nodded, head in his hands. "He's always been like this. Stubborn. Seeking attention. And he takes things so literally." Izuku suddenly stopped, his eyes widening. The classmates nearest to him went perfectly still, because they'd seen that look before. Numerous times since the entrance exam. "Oh," Sue whispered, tapping her mouth. "Midoriya has an idea." Izuku shook his head. Then nodded. He looked at the clock. "Maybe 20 minutes until class is over. Sue, do you think you could sneak some of the marbles out when Aizawa-sensei isn't looking?" She cocked her head. "Is water wet?" "Yes." "Then yes." "Okay." Some things, at least, were in their favor. Aizawa wasn't one to call them out on the small stuff, whispers, or suspicious movements, not when Bakugo was literally setting fires in his classroom, so passing notes through the class was an easy enough task. As instructed, Tsu stole 4 marbles when Aizawa turned to write on the board, quickly swallowing them so the evidence was gone. A minute later, Toru stripped off each piece of her uniform, with Momo restraining Mineta in the back, and snuck a whole handful while Ida distracted Aizawa with a question. The windows were open to accommodate the weather, and Koda had a visiting bird steal 3 more. Uraraka lifted a few on her way to the bathroom. Jiro and Kaminari briefly blew out the lights, giving Tokoyami's dark shadow the chance to grab the rest. When the bell rang, Aizawa snapped his notes shut. He turned, staring blankly down at the jar. 10 minutes for every marble, Izuku whispered. He didn't say we couldn't take the marbles out. The class waited with bated breath, until Aizawa grinned again, this one a little softer. Teamwork, he muttered, tracing the rim of the jar. Yep. However, keep in mind that I won't be so easy to fool tomorrow. See you? Aizawa raised a hand as he left, waving. The class was left staring until the door slid shut behind him. Once again, everyone began talking at once. Was that a test? Ida cried out. Or is it meant to be a punishment? Uraraka pulled a face. I guess it's only punishment if we fail to get them all back? Oh, come on. Ashido gripped at her hair. You heard him. We can't pull the same tricks tomorrow. How long are we supposed to keep this up? As one, they all had the sinking feeling that the answer was forever, or at least for as long as they were at UA, which honestly amounted to the same thing, or so it felt. Despondent, the class slowly gathered their things while contemplating their fate. It was only as they began shuffling out that Kirishima scowled. Or Bakugo could just quit being a dick all the time. Shut up. Really, they had a better chance facing Aizawa. There was a small coffee shop almost directly between Toshi's apartment and UA, a humble place that most eschewed for reasons that honestly escaped him. It was simple, quiet, an excellent spot to ease into the day, with low lighting that was easy on his eyes and a rich aroma that always helped to settle his stomach. It really was perfect, although Toshi could admit that he might be a little biased, considering that he had saved the joint from a villain just last year, and he'd been a faithful customer ever since. Not that the employees knew who they were serving. Good morning, Yagi. He waved at Lily, shuffling up to the counter with hunched shoulders. She was already pulling a coffee together for him, and Toshi knew that it would stay perfectly hot throughout the whole morning. Not everyone's quirk was good for hero work, but everyone's was good for the world. Kids treating you well? She asked, ringing up the order. I still can't believe you teach you. Toshi found himself chuckling. It's not nearly as glamorous as the news makes it sound. The students are wonderful though. Of course they are. A handful at times, but do you have any kids of your own? Just my boy Izuku. Toshi froze as his brain caught up with his mouth, breath wheezing out of his one lung. He only moved again when he felt a wave of blood crawling up his throat. He turned to cough into his shoulder, Lily oblivious to the pure, overwhelming shock that was coursing through his veins. She said something about him seeming like a wonderful father, and Toshi nearly swallowed his own tongue. I'm not, he began, but the blood was still coming and Lily was already turning away, attention on the next customer. Toshi escaped the shop as quick as he could, minus his coffee. He changed shirts in the staff lounge, hands shaking. Did he really think of young Midoriya as? The word surfaced and then was immediately shoved down, too deep and wild for Toshi to deal with at school, where anyone might walk in and question the utter terror on his face. Because shit. He could barely handle being a teacher. Let alone, you're getting old, Toshi told himself, smiling at his reflection in the window. Smiling because he was scared. Old and sentimental. One protege and suddenly it's all this? You need to sleep more if you're making slip-ups like that. The only problem was, it wasn't just one slip-up. Whether it would have happened on its own or whether that moment in the coffee shop started something, Toshi didn't know, but from then on out Midoriya and that word seemed to go hand in hand, often when Toshi least expected it. He found himself telling frantic nurses that of course he was immediate family, convincing himself later that it was a logical lie to see how badly his student was injured, not an instinctual, blurted truth. organizing papers in preparation for the new term, and Shoyuta shoved Midoriya's form in his face, noting that there was only one emergency contact listed and that just wasn't going to fly given their problem child's luck. Toshi couldn't agree more and found himself scribbling his information down before he could question why he was experiencing the same thrill he'd once gotten from signing autographs, or why Shoyuta had brought the form directly to him. Saturday afternoon, Toshi sat next to a grandmother on the bus, happily nodding and grinning as she told him about her grandkids. When she pulled out pictures, he had to still his own hand, lest he pull out the picture of Midoriya in his wallet. Why was there a picture of Midoriya in his wallet? All Might? Was that okay? Toshi startled, looking down to find Midoriya staring up at him with bright cheeks and worried eyes. They'd been training out on the beach again, focusing on hand-to-hand, and it hadn't escaped Toshi's notice that the push and pull he'd felt for months now was growing with rapid speed, wanting desperately to erase every bump and bruise that appeared on young Midoriya's skin, yet watching his body grow stronger with something more than just teacherly pride. His mentorship with Gran Torino had never been like this. Toshi had nothing to draw from, certainly not his own childhood, and he couldn't even get teaching right, let alone something as important as, not to a boy though. Blessingly, Toshi let his eyes slip shut. Blind, he reached out until he found the top of Midoriya's head, skeletal fingers slipping between the curls and gripping gently. He focused on how the young man instinctively pressed up into his palm, the subtle shift as his shoulders began to relax. Toshi smiled, because he was still scared. But a line from his book had just come to him. You learn by doing. You can only become a teacher by teaching. Perhaps he could apply that advice to other aspects of his life. Toshi opened his eyes and was blindsided by the love in Midoriya's. He ruffled his curls, smile turning into something more genuine. Yes, son. That was perfect. Can I ask you something? Personal, Aizawa nearly rolled his eyes. 15 minutes now and neither Uraraka nor Yaoyorozu had realized that the low wall they sat on also housed their instructor, propped up on the other side in his sleeping bag. He'd hoped to spend the lunch hour in a quiet, sunny spot catching up on his sleep. Instead he was planning a lesson on spatial awareness and checking one's surroundings. Especially before divulging secrets. He could just make out Yaoyorozu's face as she stared out over UA's campus, expression puzzled. Uraraka was mostly hidden by Yaoyorozu's shoulders, but Aizawa caught movement as she took a huge bite of her sandwich. It read as embarrassment. You don't have to answer, she reassured her. No, I don't mind. What is it? Just, why do you want to be a hero? A common enough question around these parts, but one that was potentially loaded depending on the individual. Interesting that Uraraka seemed to realize that. She needn't have worried about Yaoyorozu reacting badly though. She merely tipped her head to the sky, considering. I'm not sure, she said. God, that sounds kind of horrible, doesn't it? There are so many in the class who have these big aspirations, you know? Like Todoroki. Or Deku, Uraraka agreed. They're so driven. Aizawa caught the edge of Yaoyorozu's crooked smile. Right? Drives me up the wall sometimes if I'm honest. Does everything have to be a calling? There are police officers who do the work because they're good at it and it's also just good thing to do, or doctors, firefighters, why not heroes? I guess I've never really thought of being anything else. Yaoyorozu shrugged, taking a bite of her own rice. Once we discovered my quirk it seemed pretty obvious what my career path would be. It might not be flashy like Bakugo's, but it's still good in a fight. She trailed off, watching Uraraka's head bend towards her chest. A few feet away Aizawa slowly, quietly zipped out of his sleeping bag. Why do you ask? Oh, no reason, Uraraka was quick to say. Too quick. I was just thinking about my own reasons and, I don't know. She toyed with the edge of her shirt. I guess you're right. Everyone here is so motive to be a hero and I'm just, in it for the money? Yaoyorozu finished. That's not a bad thing, isn't it? No, says the girl who's always had it. Uraraka smiled to take the sting out of her words. You'll inherit your parents' fortune, right? And even if you didn't, you could just make whatever it is you wanted. Yaoyorozu blinked like the thought had hardly occurred to her. Clothes, games, books, a quick search to see what it's made of, a little time and you could have almost anything. But you're still here. Uraraka's hands curled into fists at her side, the Tupperware shaking in her lap. You're still here, Momo? If being a hero wasn't such a lucrative career, I don't know if I would be. Then why don't you leave? The shriek the two girls let out was oddly satisfying. As Yaoyorozu lurched up, Uraraka slammed her arms down across both their lunches, keeping most of it from spilling. They turned, wide-eyed, to stare at Aizawa, rice, sandwich makings, and droplets of milk now floating around them. Sensei, Uraraka squeaked. Leave, Aizawa repeated. He dragged his sleeping bag over the wall and brushed some of the grass stains out. You want money so bad? Here. Reaching into his pocket, he tossed his wallet at her. Uraraka let out another squawk as Yaoyorozu stared. All the cards in there work, and you can spend whatever you want. I don't care. Or better yet, get her to give you some. Aizawa's eyes slid to Yaoyorozu and she tensed, automatically sitting up straighter. Doesn't even need to be some of that fortune. You said it yourself, she can make anything, yeah? Both girls blinked. What? Uraraka whispered. Aizawa rubbed the back of his neck, feigning indifference. Get her to make you money. 10,000 yen bills in 100 stacks. Do that for an afternoon and she's set. Hell, you could make Uraraka rich right now and let her get on with her life. Go on. Aizawa make a shooing motion when neither of them moved. Yaoyorozu looked to Uraraka before settling on offended. We can't do that. Why? I'm going to earn that money, Uraraka began, but Aizawa cut her off with a disgusted look. Pride like that is for the weak. If you really wanted to help your parents, you'd get them that money however you could, and quickly. He pressed as her expression melted into something devastated. Wouldn't you? Why make them wait and suffer for years while you go to school? Get your license, go pro, find an agency. You're not getting any checks for a while, kid. Stop it, Uraraka whispered. It's the logical decision. Just give her the money, Yaoyorozu. No. Yaoyorozu was a mirror image of Uraraka, hands clenched as they both shook. That's just wrong, sensei. It feels like robbing a bank, Uraraka said, sour expression drawing out a nod from Yaoyorozu. Yeah. I mean, yes, it's my body and yes, it's my quirk, but people aren't supposed to use their talents so selfishly. Heroes aren't supposed to. Heroes don't do that, Uraraka said. They sat in silence a moment, Aizawa staring them down. No, they don't, he finally agreed. Aizawa stretched, yawning. At least the decent ones don't. It's not just about the money then, is it? If it was, you really would have robbed a bank or something. Instead of devoting 3 years of your life to becoming a hero. Funny. The girls were frozen as Aizawa approached, contemplating his words. He snatched his wallet back and then the second half of Uraraka's sandwich straight out of the air. He inspected the contents. Tuna. Not bad. For interrupting my lunch, he said, taking a bite. Pay more attention to your surroundings next time. Yes, sir. All right. He wandered off, sandwich in one hand and sleeping bag in the other. Hopefully they'd get over these worries sooner rather than later. There were heroes out there with shit motives, yeah, but his kid wasn't one of them. And right before he passed out of earshot, Aizawa heard, I would make you some new clothes though if you wanted. If the sound of the two girls laughing brought a smile to his face, there was no one around to see. Young Midoriya was late. Toshi scowled down at the sand, the beautiful sunset, the pier and his own shoes. Midoriya was late and for the last 10 minutes Toshi had paced with his hand hovering over the contacts in his cell phone, worrying. With one click he could have the entirety of UA's staff out and on the streets, looking for his wayward pupil, a whole team of protective heroes at his disposal. It was knowledge that helped set Toshi's mind at ease during long nights. The downside though was that with one click he would, in fact, have a team of very protective heroes out on the street. If Midoriya was delayed for any reason other than a villain attack, Toshi would never hear the end of it. And he didn't want to put Shoyuta through that. The man's nerves were shot as it was. With a groan Toshi sat, more like collapsed, down onto the sand. He'd give Midoriya another 5 minutes. Maybe 10. But then he'd be calling someone about this, regardless of the consequences. Because heaven knew his young pupil had never been late to training before. Can you blame him? What's the rush in coming to train with an old man? Toshi waved the thought away like a bothersome fly, but he couldn't deny that questions like those had been haunting him more and more lately, creating a huge, fearsome swarm. Each time Midoriya gained a little more control of One for All, each time Toshi lost another minute of his transformation, it became harder to justify his place in the boy's life. Nearly a year ago he'd used his fearsome size and strength to inspire Midoriya to astounding heights in the span of just 10 months. Now his inspiration was mostly in the form of sideline encouragement, much of it muddled by coughing fits and spewed blood. With a sigh, Toshi leaned back on his hands, now hyper-aware of his own body. The ache in his wrists, the phlegm in his chest, a constant headache, a slight chill along his arms. No, he wasn't much use to anyone anymore. Young Midoriya was just too starstruck to realize it. He'd seen the boy's room after all. That day he'd had to carry him home after training, and the troublesome child had more All Might t-shirts than Toshi himself did. That kind of worship went deep, and Toshi was just selfish enough to take advantage of it as long as he could. Until Midoriya realized that the frail man standing before him was no longer the facade, the secret identity, but rather all that was left of his mighty hero. Well, Toshi could only collect memories for the future. He'd had the whole world stare up at him in awe, and none of it compared to Midoriya's devotion. Toshi would hold on to that for as long as he could. Hell, maybe the boy had already taken the posters down from his wall. All Might. In surprise, Toshi spit another mouthful of blood, staining the sand as he struggled to get up. In his musings he'd very nearly forgotten Midoriya's absence, and his sudden cry sent a wave of pure relief running through his body, making it shake in ways that had nothing to do with exhaustion or cold. Midoriya was running towards him with a blinding smile and, according to Toshi's careful eyes, no additional injuries. He started breathing again. "Where have you been?" Toshi cried. He dragged Midoriya into a loose headlock that had the kid squirming, calling out apologies indiscriminately. Having that mop of hair beneath his fingers was a balm the likes of which he could never replace. Toshi filed that feeling away too. "And I've told you not to go shouting that name in public, yes?" "Yes." Midoriya laughed, breaking the hold. "I'm sorry, really sorry, but the bus was late and then there was a line and my card kept not working and I—" Toshi cocked his head. "Card? You were shopping?" Midoriya suddenly froze, eyes going wide at the question. "Well, yes, but it's not really, you wouldn't, I mean?" He spiraled. One of the most powerful heroes, and the kid was still an anxious, open book, muttering into his fist like his life depended on the words. With an exasperated grin, Toshi slapped a hand down onto Midoriya's shoulder. He thankfully stilled. "You don't have to tell me if you don't want to. Boys your age buy all sorts of things. It's not like that. And I'm just glad you're here now." Toshi grinned wider, the truth of his words sending a bubble of warmth from his chest up into his throat. He might have choked on it if it wasn't the sole thing keeping him alive these days. Midoriya's eyes skid to the side though, hesitant. "I kinda want to show you," he muttered. "But will you promise not to laugh?" "Of course. I mean really promise. I swear as a hero, my boy." Those were probably the only words that could have pulled Midoriya out of his embarrassment long enough for him to dig into his backpack. He produced a box that Toshi immediately recognized as one for an action figure, the contents hidden against his chest. Midoriya stared over the top of his prize with bright red cheeks. "You promise you won't laugh?" The urge to make a quip about fanboys was nearly overwhelming. He looked legitimately nervous though, so Toshi only nodded. "No need to be embarrassed," he said. "I already know that you like to collect." The words died in Toshi's throat. In fact, for a moment the whole world blotted out in white, and he thought for sure that he was going to faint, swaying there in the uneven sand. Midoriya didn't notice, too busy explaining with hurried need how he already had all the All Might action figures, but he obviously didn't have this one, so he'd had it specially made a few weeks back. This one. The rest of Midoriya's words turned to static in Toshi's ears. Because he didn't have this one. Shoved in front of his face was a perfect replica of Toshinori Yagi, right down to the skeleton frame and deep, sunken eyes. Dressed in baggy pants and a shirt 3 sizes too big, the action figure stood with hands on his hips, looking out into the distance with a confident expression that Toshi couldn't recall ever seeing in the mirror. On the figure's pedestal was engraved 2 words, true form. Artist doesn't know who you are, Midoriya was babbling, perhaps misinterpreting Toshi's stunned expression for something like anger. I just gave him your picture and some details, nothing incriminating. I swear I would never. My dear Midoriya. Toshi wasn't sure he actually said that, his head swimming as it was, but he was able to stumble forward at least, pulling his young charge to him. All the while he was careful not to harm the precious toy that pressed against both their chests. His babbling stopped. Midoriya melted into the hug. He gripped tight with fingers around the box and raised his other hand to Toshi's shaking shoulders. All might. Somehow, tears felt thicker than blood. It took a long time before Toshi could actually speak, and when he did the question was too big for the words that contained it. You'll put that next to the others? He whispered. Why yeah. He'd never known this boy to lie. Toshi buried his face in Midoriya's hair, picturing his frail figure standing beside the all mights that lined his desk. They were all equal in Midoriya's eyes. And Toshi smiled, one of the brightest he'd ever had. His bus was loud, no doubt about that. Throw 20 kids with quirks together and chaos was bound to ensue, but do it right after a very successful training exercise. I kicked your ass? Kaminari yelled, sending a sheet of lighting up into the roof with a triumphant punch. It skittered along a few feet and then petered out, but not before giving everyone below mild, electric shocks. There was a huge roar of displeasure that Ida tried, and failed, to control. With wicked accuracy, Siro shot a piece of tap square over Kaminari's mouth, the force toppling him backwards onto Aoyama and Ishido's seat. You didn't kick my ass, he grinned, wagging a finger. Or mine, Hagakure pipped up from somewhere in the back. She still hadn't put any clothes on since her stealth maneuver back at the facility, and Jiro was forced to send her thumbs up in a vague, hopefully accurate direction. Sue cocked her head from one side to the other. Did Kaminari actually kick anyone's ass? No, came a chorus, despite Kaminari's muffled yells. Rip it? That's what I thought, and Sue's tongue shot out to snag a stray fly buzzing near Sato's head. The resulting screams of disgust nearly toppled the bus. An average day then, Uraraka thought. She was so overwhelmed by the noise and the energy around her that she nearly missed the polite tap on her shoulder. HM? Dark Shadow? Yes, though he looked a little droopy in the bright afternoon sun. With her eyes, Uraraka followed his body under the legs of her peers and over a number of empty seats. Tokoyami was subtly waving her over. Deku, Uraraka murmured, and he looked up from his notes, nudging Ida in turn. The 3 of them carefully picked their way through the chaos and up to the front of the bus. When they could see why Tokoyami had hailed Uraraka, slapped a hand over her mouth to keep from shouting out a laugh. Not that noise seemed to be having much of an impact here. You don't know what to do, Tokoyami whispered. Uraraka remembered that he'd sat next to Aizawa-sensei to discuss his own progress on today's exercise, and now here was their teacher, half collapsed over his student's shoulder in a deep, dead sleep. Uraraka could easily understand why Tokoyami looked terrified, back perfectly straight and the rest of his body unnaturally still, but they were just so cute. Aizawa in particular had the slack, peaceful look of someone who'd be out for a couple more hours. Why? Looking closely, Uraraka could see the tiniest bit of drool collecting on Tokoyami's shirt. Oh my god, she whispered. Uraraka slowly drew out her phone. Ida narrowed his eyes. Don't you dare. Oh ho, if you boys think I'm passing off an opportunity like this. They backed off at her expression, and Uraraka was free to do as she pleased. As she snapped enough pictures to fill up her storage, Izuku and Dark Shadow both leaned closer towards Aizawa. Dark Shadow made to poke at their teacher's cheek and was only stopped by a quick snap of Tokoyami's beak. Izuku hardly blinked though, studying Aizawa intently. You need to help me, Tokoyami intoned. Izuku didn't seem to be paying attention. I'm surprised he can sleep through all this, Ida said, rubbing at his ears. Someone finally pissed Bakugo off as a small explosion rang through the bus. A hot wave of heat ran over them and the smell of smoke filled the air. He's always so quick to wake up in class. He's faking then. The 4 of them turned to Izuku, chin in his hand, as he continued to stare intently at Aizawa. With a quick nod to himself, he finally stood, pointing with conviction. In class he's not really sleeping, or if he is it's just a light dose. I've suspected that for a while. You know, catch us off guard and stuff. Make us think he's not paying attention, but… Ida was already nodding seriously. I've never heard Aizawa-sensei snore before, have you? Indeed, what sounded like a small chainsaw was emanating from Aizawa's slightly open mouth. They all shook their heads and Uraraka switched to video with absolutely no shame. He must feel very safe to sleep so deeply here, Ida said, expression softening. Aizawa-sensei must trust us a great deal. We cannot let him down. We won't, Izuku said, straightening. Uraraka nodded crazily, bumping fists with them both. It was a small cluster of inspirational determination until a slight cough broke the mood. Beautiful, Tokoyami drawled. But none of that is helping me. Right? Luckily for Aizawa, he had a student who cared for him deeply and who just happened to make things weightless with a touch. A happy poke to his shoulder and Aizawa was floating off of Tokoyami, who let out a rather relieved sigh, looking like a bomb had been disabled. Uraraka carefully guided their teacher onto an empty seat as Ida jogged to the back of the bus, muttering about how he'd have Yaoyorozu make a pillow and blanket. He's really out of it, Izuku murmured, watching the steady rise and fall of Aizawa's chest. Maybe Ida's right, but this kind of exhaustion can't be normal, don't you think? Is Aizawa-sensei just so busy that he doesn't have time to sleep, as one would expect of a UA teacher and a pro hero working primarily at night, though present Mike and 13 never display this level of exhaustion? Or does he not feel safe when he does try to sleep? Stress can severely interfere with REM sleep. I'll have to look back at my notes. But if that's a factor, then maybe we should help out some way, make sure there's another hero nearby at all times so he can rest without being on guard. Deku. You're doing it again. Odash. I'm sorry. It was something to consider though, especially when Ida's small mission started quieting everyone down. One by one the other students heard about the situation, climbed over seats until they were all at the front of the bus, watching over their teacher with curiously solemn expressions. Even Bakugo was silent in the background, hands stuffed deep in his pockets. Not a whisper could be heard among the group, except for the faint ding of a message being sent. So, I love you, Kaminari said, flipping through the photos Uraraka had sent. A soft rustle of laughter started up again, everyone pulling out their phones and making various faces at the screens. Tokoyami had a distinctly red hue to his black feathers. Holy shit, he's adorable. Eraserhead. Earth's cutest and mightiest hero. How much do you think we could get for these? What? You mean the press? Yeah. Do you want to die? What I want is the new Pro Hero game. I'm not dying for your gaming addiction. No one is dying. We should delete these immediately. Hell no. Are you nuts? Absolutely not, Ida. Man, you've got Swiss for brains. Fuck Ida. Hey. Well, seriously, dude. We should send them to present Mike instead. That got a better reaction. A yell of pure glee swept through the bus as everyone started typing madly, ensuring that their favorite, gossip-spreading hero got more copies of the photos than he'd know what to do with. Or rather, hopefully he'd know exactly what to do. Aizawa slept peacefully through it all. There you are, Shoyuda. Toshi saw Aizawa's flinch at his booming voice and barreled through the crowd anyway, sliding to a stop alongside his colleague. They must have looked quite fascinating together. One a hunched figure holding a still full mug of amazake in his hand, the other, towering, grinning a megawatt smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. New Year's celebrations were in full swing and the holiday had already demanded too much of All Might's time. Soundbites for the news stations, visits to the children's hospital earlier that afternoon, dropping in on Neo Mesa to both wish him a happy holiday and raise the morale of his officers, and now the second party of the night. He'd done everything in the smallest chunks possible, but even so Toshi was pushing things to their limit tonight. He could feel blood beginning to seep between his teeth. It wouldn't be long now before he had to transform back. Aizawa noticed it too. Here, he muttered, shoving the mug at him. A little sloshed over the rim and landed between their feet. Thank you, thank you. Toshi took a large gulp to wash the coppery taste away, and though he'd pay for this on top of all the food he'd eaten earlier, for now he was just grateful. He loved celebrations like this, Toshi truly did, But maybe he was getting as old as he claimed because he just didn't have the energy for them like he once did. Only a handful of the faces out there were truly familiar to him, and the music blasting from somewhere nearby was beginning to give him a headache. He'd told Crazy Eights and Ibis that he had urgent UA matters to discuss with Aizawa-sensei, but in truth Toshi just needed a few minutes to collect his thoughts. Breathe. And there was nothing quite like sidelining with the hero community's signature wallflower. His eyes slid Aizawa's way. "You know," Toshi said, directly from the corner of his mouth, "I don't think I've ever seen you in a suit before, and I've never seen a pro-hero cower from a petite, civilian woman before." Toshi scowled. Rebecca is American and they have a horrid tradition of kissing on New Year's Eve. It was logical to make my escape. Aizawa grinned. "I know. Hisashi has had a standing bet for 6 years now. Anyone who manages to kiss me tonight wins a prize." "What's the prize?" "Bragging rights that they kissed me, apparently. But no one else knows that." Toshi was shaking before Aizawa had even finished speaking, hand pressed hard against his mouth to try and stifle the laughter. He could only imagine the kind of attempts people must have made over the years. Heroes of all sorts suspended from the rafters by thin, white strips. Oh yes, Toshi could picture it easily. That tightness in his chest wasn't just from humor though. Toshi's laughs turned into coughs until he was shaking in an entirely different manner. Aizawa watched him from the corner of his eye, frowning. "Go to bed," he said shortly, snatching the mug back. "Nizu will understand." When All Might's smile reappeared from behind his fist, it was a little more genuine, just a little more like Toshi's. "I have one more errand to run after this, but you'll make my excuses for me?" he clarified, feeling warmed by the offer. Aizawa made a sound in the back of his throat. "No excuses. It's a necessity. Go." Before he did though, Toshi took one last survey of the party, gaze finally landing on the friend, beside him. Everyone was so small when he was in this form. Some days Toshi missed that. And oh yes, this was just too perfect and could only conclude that there had been some sort of warped invitation in Aizawa's words. He never said or did anything without thinking through the consequences after all. So Toshi bent, keeping his movements slow and open, and when his quirk wasn't blasted away by fierce red eyes, he bent a little further. All Might's height provided the perfect position for Toshi to bend and plant a kiss against Aizawa's scalp. "Happy New Year, Shoyuta," he whispered, and there was the faintest hum in response. A quick press like a smaller man was rising up on the balls of his feet. "I thought you were leaving." Bragging rights, indeed. Toshi risked a hand on Aizawa's shoulder as well before miraculously leaving with all his limbs intact. The moment he was out of earshot of the music, Toshi reverted to his true form, steps slowing and head hanging a little lower. He was tired, but Toshi hadn't been lying about that ASD errand. In the pocket of his now baggy pants were 20 colorful envelopes, each containing 5,000 yen. Well, one envelope contained a little more. But Toshi was sure young Midoriya wouldn't tattle. He chuckled as he slipped into the dorm, confident that all his students were still out celebrating in their own way, knowing each room now as well as he knew the student themselves. Making use of his master key, it occurred to Toshi that regardless of the night's leniency, Aizawa would no doubt make fun of him for this action. After all, the custom of giving money was meant to be done among family, between an adult and their child. Semantics didn't stop Toshi from opening Tsu's door first though. He only paused once at the threshold. "You softy," Toshi whispered, grinning from ear to ear. He left his envelope on Tsu's bed, directly beside the other. "For homework, you'll be writing me an essay?" The whole of 1A blew out a breath at Aizawa's announcement. "That's so normal," someone whispered, and there were nods all around, a few nervous giggles too. As much as they thrived on the excitement inherent in a hero curriculum, sometimes the normal school stuff was just plain refreshing. Comforting. Ida's hand was already high in the air. "Sir, what will we be writing on and what is the expected length? Do you require a cover page, and if so, does that count towards the total? If we utilize outside sources, what citation system should we?" Aizawa's glare cut him off. "You have got to let us tell you these things before you start talking." Scrubbing at his eyes, he fished a juice box out of his sleeping bag and took a long slurp. "And the cover page never counts towards the total, got it?" "Yes, sir." "Good." You'll be writing about a pro hero. Shuffling to the blackboard, Aizawa sprung back the projection screen to reveal a messily written list. Strengths, weaknesses, quirk use, tools, sidekicks, whatever else you can think of. This is an all-purpose analysis, a way for you to show me that you're capable of critiquing another hero and identifying places for improvement. Whatever reservations you've got, get rid of them now. Aizawa made a vague motion towards the door. This isn't the time to be polite and accommodating. If you want to say something, say it. If you can't call out your peers for shitty behavior, then you're in the wrong line of work. A number of students swallowed, looking nervous. They all nodded though. Aizawa let them stew a moment longer, then sighed. I don't give a damn how long it is, but Midoriya's can't be more than 3 pages. You can write about any pro you want, but Midoriya can't write about All Might. Why do I have all the stipulations? Izuku cried. Because you're the idiot who'd give me a 20-page paper about how perfect our number 1 hero is. I'm not reading that shit. There were snickers all around as Izuku buried his face in his hands, cheeks red enough to put Bakugo's explosions to shame. Ashido leaned forward to pat his back. He's not wrong. Stop. Secondary sources aren't required, but cite anything you do use. No, I don't care what style. Ida's hand went down again. Type it up. I'm not reading your chicken scratch either. Turn it in before class on Monday. Aizawa scratched at his chin. Yeah, that's it. Any actual questions? Great. Go on, get out of here. There was the usual calamity as everyone packed up for the weekend, though with a slightly disappointed air as they all dealt with the sudden addition of a new assignment. UA wasn't big on homework, not when students needed all their extra time for training and recovery, so more than one person stayed behind to rack one another's brains, complaining all the while. And plenty found themselves near Izuku. Why are you all coming to me? He mumbled, trying to inch away from Mineta's horrifying expression. You heard Aizawa-sensei. He already hates my paper. Kirishima laughed. Nah, he's just pushing you. You've already thought of, like, everything about All Might, right? And not everything. And you write so much. You probably have a paper right here. Tsu tapped Izuku's latest notebook, causing him to hurriedly stuff it into his backpack. Can we study together this weekend, Ribbit? Please, Uraraka begged. I'm terrible at papers, and though I'd never copy your notes, you certainly won't. Ida said. Maybe we can just take a peek? You've written about 13, right? Izuku blinked. Yeah, lots. They weren't kidding when they said their quirk can easily kill. It's not an easy thing to aim or regulate, but it's particularly suited for disaster relief, which is one of the main reasons I assume they chose that focus. The ability to not just clear rubble but disintegrate it has more than half the time it takes to reach survivors in a building collapse, saving countless of lives in the process. Midoriya. Stop writing her paper. Uraraka was already taking notes though. No, let him talk. You're shameless. I'm surprised you're not doing 13, Kirishima said, pointing at Tsu. Don't you want to get into search and rescue too? She nodded, fingers tapping under her chin. Yes, but Aizawa-sensei is right. We should try to analyze a hero we're not as comfortable with. I'm thinking of doing Omen. Mineta's jaw unhinged. The guy who sees the future? Nua, he's creepy. I'm doing Midnight. No one's surprised by that, Ida murmured. He suddenly straightened. Do you think it would be inappropriate if I were to write about my brother? Not at all. Uraraka did a little dance. Besides, Aizawa-sensei will probably give you a high grade if you can be critical of a family member. He'd like that? Ida was nodding, gnawing at his lower lip. Yes. That will be difficult though. What about you, Todoroki? He'd been silent the entire conversation, hiding in the back, but he perked up at Izuku's question. Something passed between them that was missed by everyone else. A little spark of worry. I'll write about my father, he said, tone not at all like Ida speaking of Tensei. He'll expect me to... For words that only meant something to Izuku, Todoroki's eyes that, while calm, didn't quite line up with everyone else's. Yeah? Izuku said slowly. I was thinking of doing him too. After all, Endeavor is the number 2 hero. Technically. 3 days later Aizawa slammed into the faculty lounge. Holy... Mike bit off his curse, quickly lowering his voice so he didn't deafen half the school. 13 was out of their seat, already poised for a fight, while Toshi nearly lost hold of the cup he'd been drinking from, tea splashing across the table. All three of them stared as Aizawa kicked the door closed with his foot. He was staring down at a small stack of papers, expression unreadable. Shoyuda? Aizawa planted his hand across Mick's face and shoved him back onto the couch. Endeavor, he read, voice as blank as his expression. An analysis of why the world's second greatest hero no longer deserves his title. Two eyebrows rose high into blonde hair. 13 sat back down with its thump. Pleased with the attention, Aizawa cleared his throat before continuing. Endeavor, civilian name Enji Todoroki, has been hailed as the world's second greatest hero for nearly a decade now, surpassed only by All Might. It's admittedly easy to maintain a position once it has been established, hard to go against the status quo, and there's little doubt that Endeavor's position within our community is rarely, if ever, challenged. Given his power and strong media presence, it's easy to see why most would consider Endeavor to be one of the best pros currently on the streets, but this essay will provide a step-by-step, detailed account as to why continuing this thinking is both dangerous and insulting to the entire hero community. Oh my goodness, Toshi whispered. Aizawa held up a hand for silence. To begin, he read, one of the foundational teachings a budding hero learns is to minimize structural damage and do everything possible to keep civilians out of the crossfire, a lesson we've worked hard to practice here at UA. However, despite the fact that this is easily understood by high schoolers, Endeavor has proven time and time again that he prizes his own success over the people he's supposedly there to protect. On page 7, Aizawa flapped another sheet at them, which 13 quickly snatched up, is an alphabetized list of complaints filed against Endeavor by police officers, paramedics, and firefighters since his debut. To summarize, Endeavor frequently uses his quirk with reckless abandon, shooting off walls of fire that are wide enough to singe nearby civilians and fellow heroes, as well as harming the structural integrity of buildings by melting them with his lava. One account, which was squashed by the media but helpfully supplied for this paper by Detective Naomasa Tsukachi, claims that Endeavor's lava caused an apartment building to collapse hours after he left the scene of the fight, killing a father, an old woman, and resulting in numerous injuries, whereas the fight against the actual villain led to no injuries at all. Aizawa slowly looked up, taking in their shocked expressions. It goes on for another 2 pages and this is point 1 of 6, he said. A smile was growing now, taking up the entirety of Aizawa's face. 1 of 6 and he roasts Endeavor in every one of them. Pun intended? Mike whispered numbly and got another shove for his trouble. Best goddamn paper I've ever read. He's getting full marks. I don't care if the brat did write 20 pages like I told him not to. He's getting full marks and I'm half tempted to publish this on one of those ridiculous blogs. People need to see it. Aizawa shook the papers emphatically. That sounds like a good way of turning the public against UA, 13 murmured, though they were still staring down at the list of complaints, the fingertips of their glove lightly touching the paper. But I had no idea that, God. It's true. Sources look good. A lot of personal accounts, but I'm a friend of Tsukachi's, Toshi said absently. He'd snatched the last few pages, turning them over frantically. Which of the children wrote dash? Aizawa held out the cover page for him. Izuku Midoriya was typed in huge, proud letters. Mike let out a furious cackle as Toshi gave a grin to match Aizawa's. Young Midoriya? Goddamn problem child, yeah? Toshi still had the last few papers in hand, hopping in place as he wiped blood from his chin and read through the final lines. Though second greatest hero isn't an official title sanctioned by our or any other government, there's little doubt that it comes with a number of perks, and certainly a large amount of responsibility. I am not a pro-hero myself yet, but I nevertheless feel that it's my duty to call for a revocation of Endeavor's title. He is not the second greatest hero, he is barely a hero at all. Savage, Mike crowed, stomping his feet hard enough to make the table shake. 13 lifted a hand to their visor like they were attempting to cover a laugh. Which still leaves the title open, of course. I personally suggest, Toshi suddenly cut off, blinking. Shoyuda? Have you finished this yet? What? It's 20 pages. Impossibly, Toshi's grin grew bigger. I personally suggest that it should instead be given to a lesser-known hero by the name of Eraserhead. And the fucking kid just lost his perfect score. Izuku did, in fact, receive a 99 out of 100 on the paper, something hot and satisfying blooming in his chest when the only comments pertained to criticisms that he'd failed to mention. But then, the paper was already 17 pages over his limit, so he could be forgiven for missing a few things. Aizawa knew. 13. Mike, Toshi, and Izuku knew. It wasn't something they could tell the public, not yet, but maybe someday when they were all a little stronger and Izuku's words were a little more polished. When they held more weight. For now he just made sure to accidentally slip his paper into Todoroki's bag at lunch. It should make for a good read. In retrospect, putting his paper where Endeavor could easily find it wasn't Izuku's smartest move. They knew. The moment he passed through UA's security system, they knew. Just as All Might was capable of changing the atmospheric pressure to cause rain on a sunny day, Endeavor's quirk impacted the environment around him, most notably the temperature. Izuku had noticed it with Todoroki these last few months. A little chilly when you sat on his right side, the perfect heater if you sat on his left, but that had nothing on the spike in temperature that suddenly engulfed 1A's classroom, causing Tsuyu to shrink uncomfortably and Bakugo to look questioningly at his hands. Izuku wished his friend was just throwing another fit. This was why heroes needed balance in their lives. Aizawa noticed it too, the sudden change in temperature, a presence that drew them out of their studies. He set the book he'd been reading from carefully back on the table. "Wait here," he said. It was a tone they'd heard back at USJ, and this time everyone obeyed the order, all leaning closer to one another with fists formed and feet planted firmly, ready for a fight. The door slammed open before Aizawa had reached it though. No, wait. It had partially melted open, the edge curling as lava ate away at it, emanating from a black and silver glove. Izuku watched, mouth open, as the heat climbed up and up their massive doorway until most of it was pouring smoke, hot globs of flaming debris falling back to the floor. And among the flames stood Endeavor, his right hand holding what looked suspiciously like a charred stack of paper. Izuku swallowed. Aizawa only surveyed the mess stoically. "You're paying for the repairs. Kids, head into Class 1B. Now, Izuku never thought he'd get to see someone shoo Endeavor, but that's exactly what Aizawa did, flapping his hand at a hero 3 times his size until the man finally stepped aside, though his teeth were bared. Under Ida's instructions they quickly picked their way through the mess and came out on the other side, staring as Endeavor shut what was left of the door. "Holy shit," Ciro whispered. Everyone nodded. 1B was already outside their classroom, the two groups crowding together as students began fierce whispering back and forth, trying to figure out what had brought the number 2 hero to UA in such a rage. Right before the door had closed, Endeavor had looked out over 40 kids, seeming to glare at each and every one of them, but Izuku knew that look was aimed at him. And he knew exactly what this was about. Plus, he thought. Izuku found Todoroki in the very back, reaching for him with a confidence they hadn't possessed months back. A certain level of tactile understanding. Todoroki grabbed hold of Izuku's forearm with no hesitation, and he could feel the ice still coating his skin. He'd been prepping for a fight too. "You okay?" Izuku whispered. Todoroki gave a short nod. "I left it in my room." A squeeze through Izuku's uniform. An apology. Wanted to reread it. There were all sorts of awful details that Izuku's mind picked up on, that his words had brought Todoroki some kind of strange reassurance, that Endeavor had gone through his son's stuff, but there was something else too, the faintest tilt to Todoroki's voice that had Izuku suddenly smiling again. He inched a little closer, the two of them looking out on the small sea of confused peers. "You, liked it?" "It's burned now." Izuku laughed. "Ah, come on. I have so many copies." In retrospect, things would have been a whole lot worse if they didn't have Aizawa-sensei on their side. But oh, they did. "Teaching as I see fit," he could be heard saying, voice soft and almost bored. A few of the other students were trying to sneak peeks through the burned parts of the door without getting caught. "If you have a problem with that, I most certainly have a problem with your students spreading slander about me." Izuku could easily picture Aizawa running a hand through his hair, wincing at the volume. "Slander implies a damage to your reputation, and no one other than the student and myself has seen the essay. Slander also implies falsehood." There was a pause. Are the accusations false? Of course they're false. I'll have to recheck his sources then. They seemed rather persuasive. There was a yell of pure, inarticulate rage that shut everyone up fast, most of 1A rushing forward instinctually. They needn't have bothered. A second later the door flew open again, Endeavor stumbling backwards through the opening. It took Izuku a moment to even recognize him because he'd never seen the man without his flames before. He looked smaller. Aizawa stepped out a second later, eyes wide and bright red, his scarf gently floating around his shoulders. I told you to stop breaking our stuff, he said, voice cold. Those desks aren't cheap, you know, and as the class president is so very fond of reminding us, a lot of craftsmanship went into making them. Aizawa tilted his head. I think it's time you left, Endeavor. He held his ground though, even flanked by students and face-to-face with Eraserhead. Everyone in the hallway knew that Aizawa couldn't hold the fire back for long, that even if he could, Endeavor was still impossibly strong on his own, but none of that seemed to matter. No one spoke or even breathed, lest Aizawa turn his gaze on them instead. The brat should be expelled, Endeavor said. There wasn't much punch behind his words though. They came out flimsy and frail. I don't expel kids with potential. Now get out. You're wasting my class time. Impossibly, Endeavor went. It wasn't quietly, and the look he cast both Izuku and Todoroki left no question about his feelings, but he did leave. Aizawa's eyes traced him all the way down the hallway, and they only heard the rush of returning flames when Endeavor rounded the corner. Aizawa immediately pressed a hand to his face. Hair fell around his shoulders. What a clusterfuck, he muttered. There was silence. Excuse me, sensei? It was a boy from 1B, Eiji, with long silver hair and the most delicate hands Izuku had ever seen. They were already reaching. If you'd like, I can fix the door for you. My quirk. I returned things to their original state. Eiji's fingers stretched like he was just itching to fix this. Izuku understood the feeling well. Aizawa shook his head though, eyes still closed. Oh. Heroes aren't above the damage they do, even Endeavor. Remember that. Midoriya, Todoroki, you're with me. The rest of you go study or something. Izuku only noticed the absence of Todoroki's hand when it finally dropped to follow Aizawa down the hall. They left the merged groups behind them, Uraraka and Ida briefly moving like they wanted to follow. When they were out of earshot though, Todoroki caught Izuku's gaze and they both nodded as one, speeding up to flank Aizawa rather than keeping behind. You can't punish Midoriya for this, Todoroki said. Everything he said was true. Izuku bit hard into his lower lip. I'll admit that proving it is harder. A lot of the accounts are hearsay, but there are no recordings because Endeavor has a bad habit of melting cameras and phones, Aizawa finished. He came to a stop in the deserted hall, scrubbing a hand over his face. He looked more worn out than usual. I'm not punishing anyone. You two need to talk to the principal though. Be on your guard. Because truth or not, a pro has just violently interrupted a UA class to demand your expulsion. Unexpectedly, Aizawa's hands rose to drop gently on top of both their heads. Izuku blinked up at him while Todoroki swayed a little under the gesture. Sensei? Remember today? It's your point 7. In retrospect, that couldn't have been the end of things. Present Mike? Threen. Seimin. All Might. Omen. M-Lady. Midnight. Ibis. Ingenium. Crazy Eights. Midnight, but it wasn't for pervy reasons, okay? Present Mike. Snipe. Best Genist. Recovery Girl. I was All Might too. Sim. Eraserhead. Everyone stared at Bakugo, who looked like he was very close to smoking around the ears. What? I thought if I wrote about him he'd give me a good grade. And did he? Ida asked. Bakugo's scowl said it all. Still, the rest of 1A had gotten what they were after. Out of them all, only 2 had written about Endeavor, and they highly doubted that the competitive pro was trying to expel his own son. Which only left one student to write something slanderous enough to warrant this kind of reaction. Uraraka tapped her fingers together in concentration, unconsciously floating just a few inches off the ground. I wonder what Deku wrote in that paper. I knew that something like this would happen. Toshi smiled behind his mug of tea. No, Netsu hadn't changed at all in the years he'd known him. Happy-go-lucky he might seem, but there was a distinct undercurrent of smugness in his tone, contrasting that smile. Nezu never wasted an opportunity to demonstrate how much smarter he was than all of humanity, and frankly Toshi couldn't blame him. Mike finally took the bait. A simple "oh" was enough to broaden Nezu's smile and have him jumping down from the lounge's couch. After running to the small kitchenette, came back with a paw full of uncooked spaghetti. "What the hell?" Aizawa muttered. Toshi hesitantly raised a hand to say that the pasta he was currently getting for all over was meant to be his lunch, and then thought better of it. "I'll treat you to something better," Nezu chirped, and Toshi hung his head. "Thanks." Food crisis averted, Nezu began laying each piece of spaghetti on the low table, occasionally pausing, considering, and then pushing one strand closer to another, or widening two groups just a bit. He seemed particularly interested in the spaces he created, going so far as to measure them with the tips of his paws. A few minutes later he was done, and Mike elbowed Aizawa in the ribs to wake him up again. "These are timelines," Nezu said, pointing to the pasta. "Of course, there's far, far more than what's shown here, but for the sake of simplicity let's say that this encompasses every possible outcome, that this is somehow a representation of infinity." He spread his arms wide over the display. It looked a little like a crudely drawn sun. "Now yes, there's an infinite number of results to every situation, but should we care about them all? Because most of these vary only slightly in their details. There are, for example, countless universes where our dear Toshi attended this meeting with different colored socks." "Socks?" Toshi blinked. "Yes, socks. There's the universe where you wore black, or green, or pink, or blue, countless more where they're light blue, stripped, with polka dots or stars. I don't own blue polka dot socks." You should. "Why are we talking about socks?" Aizawa grumbled. He squirmed a little further into the couch cushions. Nezu clapped his paws together. "We're not. Because we don't care about all the universes where Toshi wore different socks to this meeting. We only care about the universes where he shows up at all." Nezu bent, slowly making the space between groups of pasta a little bigger. "That's what I see with my quirk. The noticeable deviations. The final results, even if all the details are still a surprise. These," he pointed to 3 small groups of just a few strands each, "represent timelines where our dear Midoriya moves on from his little tiff with Endeavor and is dealt no further consequences. But these," Nezu's paw strayed to a much larger, fuller group. "These are the timelines where he doesn't." Mike poked at the table. "You needed pasta to tell us that the Midoriya kid is stubborn? Visual metaphors are an excellent learning tool. You should incorporate them into your teaching more." "Is it wrong of me to be proud?" Toshi said it to the hands in his lap, but he didn't miss the other teachers' reactions. Mike frantically shaking his head in his peripheral vision, Aizawa's snort of amusement, a small paw on his shoulder. Young Midoriya's essay had been a bright spot of amusement just a few days before. After Endeavor's visit though, Toshi was no longer convinced that mere conversation was the way to handle that man. Nezu was still all smiles though as he hopped up onto the table, scattering the pasta to the floor. "No one is at fault here," he said kindly. "Shoyuta set an assignment and Midoriya fulfilled it to the best of his ability. Nothing more, nothing less." A shifty look said he knew exactly what else had gone down surrounding these events, but Nezu was letting them slide. "There are many factors at work now. Endeavor is quite displeased, of course, and he will not let go of that anger easily. Midoriya has a gift in his writing and analysis, a gift that I think we should nurture, especially if he is to replace you as our symbol of peace." Nezu turned to face Toshi, paws clasped to his chest. "And I'm afraid that most of the school already knows about the essay, so it actually matters little what we decide here today. The wheels are already turning, so to speak." Aizawa muttered something unflattering under his breath. "So you just dragged us here to tell us that you've already done whatever the hell it is you wanted to do?" "In part." Nezu hopped down. Now, his smile was just a touch unsettling. "I told Midoriya to start his own blog. Uraraka and Ida had cornered him the moment Izuku had returned from the principal's office and demanded to see the essay. Despite his best efforts, you're a terrible liar, Deku. He'd caved in under 5 minutes, emailing them both a copy while sending a new one to Todoroki. The subject title on each was innocuous, Not that it would matter in the long run. Because Ida first showed Yaoyorozu, only because as class presidents they should both be informed of the situation. And Uraraka showed Tsuyu, but only because she was such a tight part of their group now. She'd know if they were keeping secrets. Tsuyu told Tokoyami and Yaoyorozu told Ojiro. The paper spread to Jiro, Siro, Kaminari and Kirishima. And if so many in 1A knew, shouldn't they all? 1B had seen the fallout, shouldn't they see the cause? The paper swept through general studies and the support group, surviving everything from Bakugo's flames to the overall skepticism. Had skittish Midoriya really written this? Netsu didn't know that the whole school had read the paper. It was just common sense. I can't do this, Izuku whispered. Of course you can, Uraraka said. She pumped the air with her fist. That's your name now, yeah? You're gonna do your best. Plus ultra. Ida pushed up his glasses. They slid down his nose. He pushed them up again. It is rather intimidating. Tsuyu laid long fingers across Izuku's shoulder in a show of comfort. Think of it this way. You already have a large audience. Everyone here. And it was well received by us. Well received? Oyama cried. That is an insult to Midoriya's masterpiece. Behind him Koda nodded. Yaoyorozu pursed her lips. If it makes you feel any better, people might not read it at all. I just mean, she said quickly, raising her hands at Kirishima and Ishido's looks. There are already so many hero blogs out there. We can't expect Midoriya's to get noticed right off the bat. So, that's sort of comforting. Just fucking do it already, you nerd. Bakugo slipped off his desk and wandered away. Nothing for it then. Izuku looked to Jiro and got a thumbs up in return. She'd been the one to design and start up the website, a simple green and yellow layout that read Deku, Musings of a Hero in Training across the top. With her approval Izuku looked to Todoroki next. Just promise me something, he said and Izuku blinked, nodding quickly. Tell the truth, whether people want to hear it or not. He could do that. Taking a deep breath, Izuku hit submit and published his first post. In the end Yaoyorozu was right. No one noticed another blog among thousands. It gave Izuku time to come to terms with the whole idea of putting the things he scribbled into his journals out for the public's consumption, revised or not. They divided his essay into 6 posts, 1 for every section, and each was heavily edited by Ida, Yaoyorozu, and Todoroki to keep him from rambling. They solidified the information Izuku had already collected and got permission from eyewitnesses to quote them in full. Tokoyami had been smart enough to snap pictures of their doorway before it was replaced, and those were uploaded along with post number 7. By the time a week had passed, Izuku was used to the shape of his new blog. The pale green for him, the yellow trim for All Might, and he found that it was actually fun to write for an audience, even if they never wrote back. He had so much to say about all the heroes and Izuku said it, feeling like something had slotted into place. Really, this was just notebook number 14, new and improved. Things were settling. It didn't last, of course. Izuku had forgotten that Tsuyu was right too. He already had an audience, the entirety of UA, students and teachers alike checking his blog with a rather unprofessional kind of glee. It landed him more hits than any other new blog could hope to achieve, and more hits meant more recognition. Izuku didn't take into consideration that after a week Jiro added an about page that included his picture, that people would recognize him as the young boy who tried to take on the sludge monster even before he'd entered UA, who'd won the first leg of the sports festival without using his quirk, who, people said, was so earnest and warm when they saw him on the street that he barely managed to say anything at all. Izuku just blushed, smiling like the sun. Now that he was given the chance to speak, who wouldn't believe a boy like that? Very few, apparently. Midoriya. Present Mike slid into the cafeteria almost a month later, landing in a pose by their table that had most of 1A laughing and Aoyama taking notes. He pointed dramatically at Izuku, causing him to rear back in his seat. You are never going to guess who I landed for my show this weekend. An extra special, extra cool, totally influential dude who is going to bring the house down. Oh. Izuku suddenly leaned forward again, nearly sticking his elbow in his chicken. Not All Might? What? He's been on like 20 times? Izuku nodded. He knew. He'd listened to each and every interview. Emilady then? As the newcomer? No. Wait. Wait, it's Omen, isn't it? I just heard that he saved a whole preschool from... No, that guy gives me the creeps. Mike rubbed at his arms, looking severely put out. Geez, you're dense. It's you, Kit. The whole cafeteria was listening in at this point. No one spoke. There wasn't even the sound of a utensil scraping a plate. When Izuku found the strength to answer, he nearly brought the whole building down around them. What? Jiro snorted into her rice. You haven't been looking at your hit counter, have you? Saturday night. It was normally the height of criminal activity, but between All Might's move to the city and the League of Villains staking their claim, things had slowed down considerably, enough that Aizawa only felt slightly guilty about catching up on his grading. A stack of practice exams, a mug of tea, and ashes winding around his ankles. This was the closest he came to peace nowadays. He also had the radio tuned to Hisashi Station. Not because Aizawa was a listener. He was just too lazy to get up and change it. Hello, my wonderful listeners. Are you out on the town? Cozy in bed? Doesn't matter because you're all tuning in. I've got a real treat for you tonight. A pint-sized sprout you'd all be cooing over if you could just see his face, but I guess you'll just have Tio settle for his, sort of flimsy voice if I'm honest. But that's fine. Totally cool. Let's get this party started. So stupid, Aizawa muttered. He made another mark on Shoji's exam, took a sip of his tea. I've got little Midoriya Izuku here. And promptly spit it out. Hello, everyone. It's such an honor to be on the show. Really? You're a devoted listener too, right, Midoriya? Of course. Yeah, you are. Not too shabby yourself though, huh? For those of you just tuning in, or who have somehow been living under an all-might-sized rock, this little dude has been making quite the name for himself in the blog sphere the last few weeks. A number of controversial posts challenging the status of our number 2 hero. And yes, listeners, I've got my air quotes going. You're turning all sorts of heads with those claims, Midoriya. Well, I wouldn't say that I'd never intended to. He's blushing, folks. Water's right there, Kit. Take your time. We've got all night. Now, I know our faithful listeners are just dying to hear more about your thoughts on Endeavor, the recent rise of quirk vigilantes too, based on those blog comments, but indulge your host a little bit first. Yes. Absolutely. What about? Do tell us more about why the mysterious Eraserhead should be our number 2 instead. Aizawa didn't notice that he'd shattered the mug in his hand, tea running off the table and onto the floor where Ashes happily licked it up. He was staring at the small radio on his kitchen counter, quirk entirely useless here, but active nonetheless. Monday I'm killing them both? Funny, how miracles happen. What Izuku didn't realize when he first started his paper was that knowledge spirals, and truth, once spoken, is powerful indeed. Toshi understood it, even more than Aizawa. It was why he posed and smiled for the cameras, kissed every baby and signed every piece of paper, even before the fans could ask. Because they were heroes. Yes, but they were only granted that title from the people they helped. They couldn't give it to themselves. And a hero, above all, made people feel safe. Safety wasn't just punching out sludge monsters or pulling kids from burning buildings. There had to be trust too. And the people trusted Izuku, trusted him enough to start questioning their trust in others. He had a bad habit of ignoring the comments on his blog. As much as Izuku wanted to chat about, well, everything, a part of him was still too nervous to act as the authority, to face whatever judgment his readers had for him. It meant that Izuku missed the first wave when it came. The comments that, while emerging from many hands, all boiled down to the same message. Fuck Endeavor, holy SJ, and Eraserhead? Why isn't this kid our number 2? By the way, he forgot to mention that this is the story of how Izuku became a great and beloved hero. Concepts of beauty had changed drastically since the arrival of quirks. Where once humanity had obsessed over nose sizes and thigh gaps, the texture of a person's hair or just how symmetrical their face was, now, generations later, the concept of attraction had broadened considerably. How could it not, when so many people didn't even look human anymore? Most considered that growth to be one of their greatest advancements, well worth the loss of things like space travel. So, That wasn't to say that the concept of ugliness had been eradicated. Far from it, and Toshi was well aware that neither he nor Aizawa quite fit the concept of handsome. For a long time it was one of the few similarities he could find between them. This though. Goodness, Shoyuta. When was the last time you took a bath? It slipped out. One of those quick, thoughtless comments that got easier when you were running on 3 hours of sleep and a constant stream of high-stress situations, which was exactly Toshi's life now. The sky outside UA had darkened considerably and they were, to his knowledge, the only 2 teachers left on campus. Toshi had passed through the lounge with the intent of just retrieving his lunchbox and had been unsurprised to find Aizawa still hard at work on the couch, a small mountain of papers spread out over crossed legs. It would have been a common enough scene if not for the smell. Toshi was well familiar with the rank stench of bodies gone stale, both others and his own after a particularly gruesome fight, where sweat and blood and even urine would combine into an assault on the senses. It wasn't anything to be ashamed of, just a little surprising to find in these hallowed halls on a calm, Tuesday afternoon. Aizawa smelled like a battlefield and it was just startling enough for Toshi to slip in his manners. He tried to apologize a second later, only succeeding in coughing into his fist as embarrassment crawled up his throat. Luckily, Aizawa wasn't one to take offense for truthful statements. He shifted, just a sliver of eyes peering up at Toshi. Almost a week, he said, the truth startling Toshi enough that his coughing ceased. Slowly, Aizawa looked out through the window with a focus that would have read as self-conscious on anyone else. Recovery girl won't remove the bandages for another 3 days. Yes, Toshi could see how that would be a bit of a problem. Most seemed to believe that those with healing quirks provided cure-alls for the hero community, but as his reckless Midoriya had learned firsthand, Recovery Girl only sped up a natural process, relying on the person's stamina to do the rest of the job. Aizawa didn't have any stamina, not after the beating he'd taken at USJ. He had to rely on good old-fashioned time. And a fully bandaged head and torso didn't lend themselves to long soaks. Hell, Aizawa didn't even have use of his hands right now. Whatever work he thought he was doing in here, all alone, in a quickly darkening lounge, had to be more for show than anything else. Aizawa wasn't the type to slack off, even if he had to work simply by staring at the papers he couldn't mark yet. Toshi found himself inching forward. It was stupid, but he got the same feeling as when he'd approached unstable villains in the PA, those he could possibly talk down from a fight, but only if he was very, very careful. Toshi kept his shoulders loose and his hands visible at his sides. He focused in on the lank hair falling around Aizawa's shoulders. I could help with that, he said. Oh, one of these days Toshi's mouth was really going to get him into trouble. And that day was today. Because in what goddamn universe was that an appropriate thing to say to a colleague? Help Aizawa with what, exactly? Bathing him? Putting it that way had a hysterical laugh bubbling up Toshi's throat, and it took a Herculean effort to shove it back down. Yes, he was sleep-deprived and no doubt a little addled in his old age. Perhaps losing one for all had weakened his mind as well as his body, because Toshi couldn't think of any other reason why he'd go suggest something so. Okay, Toshi whispered. He held up a finger, pausing because damn it, the man was impossible to read on a normal day, let alone with his face entirely swathed in bandages. Toshi ending up standing there stupidly until Aizawa grunted in annoyance. Right? I'll be back. Just don't move, okay? I promise I'll be right back. Idiot, Toshi thought he heard, but by then he was already out the door. UA's campus really was too large, especially when one was trying to get off campus and over to the corner store 2 blocks away. Luckily, Toshi wasn't so frail yet that he couldn't indulge in an all-out sprint, and long, lanky legs were good for this at least. Within 20 minutes he was back in the doorway of the lounge, a bag with shampoo and conditioner in one hand, his other trying to keep his remaining lung from exploding out of his chest. Sink, Toshi panted and Aizawa nodded, shuffling and using one arm to drag a chair with him. They fell into silence after that, but it wasn't a silence that Toshi felt comfortable in just yet. Too new. Too flimsy. He puttered over to his laptop and booted up some music, keeping it low and glancing frequently to make sure Aizawa didn't mind. If he did, he wouldn't say. There were strains of the latest pop trend as Toshi made sure the sink was as clean as it ever was and got the water as hot as it would go. Aizawa settled in the chair with his head resting on the counter. Toshi's lips twitched. That can't be comfortable. It's fine. Nonsense. Here, and when Toshi slipped off his jacket to use as a cushion, Aizawa didn't refuse it. I've done this before, he continued. Like the music, speaking just made things easier. It distracted him enough to actually touch Aizawa's hair, fanning it out under the water, spidery fingers being careful of the bandages up around his forehead and ears. Tessa, hero named Foxglove. She let me wash her hair too. Aizawa made a humming sound in the back of his throat. His eyes had slipped shut. Don't know her? Oh no, you wouldn't. An American hero, before your time, and like most she died young. Toshi's hands tightened a moment. They shook a little as he poured out the shampoo. Most referred to her quirk as poison, but it was more complicated than that. She was a flower, and like many she had her thorns. Every few weeks her hands would secrete a toxin, not unlike young Bakugo's nitroglycerin, and though her mentor crafted special gloves to protect others, they were rather cumbersome. Poor girl would get so frustrated. Toshi trailed off into chuckles, eyes straying to Aizawa's own bandaged hands. How have you been eating? Another grunt. Straws. The things they did as heroes. Everyone knew about what happened out on the streets, praised and often revered them for it, but few bothered to think through the aftermath, what came about once the villains were captured and the debris cleared away. Only someone who'd been there understood how demeaning it could become. One needed friends. As such, Toshi was hyper-aware of the strands between his fingers. He took his time untangling them, gently rubbing conditioner in and keeping the water comfortably warm. When the coughing started up again, Toshi did it as quietly as he could, mouth hard pressed into his shoulder, because as the minutes passed he could swear that, Shoyuda? The only response he got was deep breathing behind the bandages. What a liar. Aizawa spent so much time criticizing UA and the pros and especially All Might in particular, yet it was only here that he continually slept. For the men who tensed at every bang and kept knives beneath their pillows, that said a great deal. Toshi slowed his movements, remembering the past, overly grateful for this future, so much so that he had to close his own eyes as something fierce raced through his chest. This was rare. Worth treasuring. He'd spend as long as he could untangling the mess Aizawa had made of his hair, washing and rewashing it until the water went cold. Anything that would give them both an excuse to stay in this peaceful pocket just a little while longer. After all, heroes needed their rest to heal. Just as a heads up, Omen will be on campus later today. The response was immediate and Aizawa waited for all the reactions to die down. A little dramatic for his taste, but perhaps not entirely unwarranted. When the kids were mostly done whispering and gasping, he raised his hand for total silence. For once he actually got it. He's meeting with Nedzu and the other hero professors at 4 o'clock, so he'll be passing through the main hall starting at 3:45. Or hell, maybe a little earlier. I don't know. The guy is still human. Aizawa flapped another hand at the outcry that got. I'll be attending the meeting so the day will end early at 3 o'clock. If you don't want to get caught up in his quirk, then don't stay here. It's as simple as that. But I won't have any of you treating him like some sideshow attraction either. Conduct yourself in a manner befitting you. Got it? They got it. It wasn't just Ida taking things seriously, even Bakugo nodded his understanding and Aizawa took a moment to appreciate the utter solemnity that had befallen his class. He'd sure as hell never experience this again. Alright, if anyone needs to talk about it further, I'm not going anywhere. It was the closest thing to comfort that Aizawa knew how to give and his kids ate it up, a few of them going so far as to melt back into their seats, relief washing over their faces. It shouldn't come to that though. He had every expectation that by 3:15 they'd all be long gone. If they were smart, then English next. Yamada will be here in a minute. He left and the silence broke. Do you think President Mike will let us out early? Yaoyorozu asked, voice carrying high above the others. When she glanced at the clock, everyone else followed her lead, like they were afraid it had suddenly jumped ahead an hour without them realizing. I don't want to get caught up in... A vague gesture finished her thought. You know, Kaminari was already nodding. Tell me about it. I got a cousin, lives outside the city, used to anyway. Himeromen into. Like Yaoyorozu, he twisted a finger around his temple, letting gestures convey what words could not. He lost it when I was about 2. Never the same after that, I swear. It was Tokoyami who leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. If you were only 2 when they met, how do you know your cousin changed so drastically? What if he's simply always been that way? Because my mom said so? Your mother sounds gullible. You. Hey. Ida got between the two of them, arms raised high above his head. He waited until Dark Shadow had closed his beak and the static electricity had died down. Fighting among ourselves is not appropriate behavior. Actions befitting this institution, remember? Besides, Ida took his glasses off to wipe them on his shirt. He only succeeded in leaving sweat stains. I too think it best that we leave as soon as class is finished. As a group, a number of other students concurred. Tokoyami scowled. I just don't think it's befitting to assume that another hero's quirk is evil. None of them missed the hand he drew down Dark Shadow's flank. Fear like this is? Tokoyami shook his head. Natural? Kirishima snapped. Behind him Mineta yelled out his agreement. I'm not saying the dude is evil, but I sure as hell don't want him near me. Why? Tokoyami challenged. You know why. So you wouldn't want someone else with a similar quirk near you either? How is that okay? There isn't anyone. Those who'd been leaning too close together finally pulled back, turning to face Izuku instead. He'd muttered the soft comment almost to himself, staring hard down at his latest journal, only lifting his gaze when he realized that the rest of the class was waiting for more. Izuku gently touched the pages. There isn't anyone else like Omen out there, he clarified. It's not just what he does, but how he does it. Izuku ran a hand through his hair, trying to explain. It's passive? Passive? Uraraka whispered. I mean, you decide when to use your quirk, right? He waited as a number of his classmates thought that through, eventually nodding. Uraraka, you decide when to make something float. Or Todoroki, you choose when to create ice? Or fire. Todoroki slid a little down in his seat, but he didn't refute Izuku's point. That control is really important, right? It's what has kept our society from descending into chaos with quirks and, I think at least, what separates the heroes from the villains. Not the kind of quirk you end up with, but what you choose to do with it. Izuku stared down at his own hands. He could feel one for all thrumming through his veins even now. Untapped power that was still too much for his body to handle, but for him control could be learned. There's differences, I guess, he said. Like, Tsuyu, Shoji, Ashido, you guys can't help how you look. Just because you can, say, control when you use your acid doesn't mean you can suddenly turn your skin a color other than pink. Why would I want to? Ashido grinned. The joke fell flat though. Endeavor can't turn his flames off, but he decides whether to wield them as a weapon. Present Mike can't change his voice, but he can stop himself from yelling. Things like that. All our quirks are active skills in one manner or another, except, Izuku's eyes suddenly widened. He whipped his head until he found the floating uniform behind Ida. Hagakure. Your quirk might actually be the closest to Omen's. The jacket and tie reared backwards. Me, she squeaked. At least structurally. You can't make yourself visible, can you? So you have less control over your quirk than we do, Izuku said it slowly, testing the hypothesis on the tip of his tongue. In some ways it's more a part of you than ours are. Sure, our quirks are always there, but we get to decide whether they'll be a part of our lives each and every day. You don't, and neither does Omen. For him it's there whether he wants it or not. Everyone chewed on that. Even Tokoyami deflated. That sounds rough, Uraraka murmured. But, isn't anyone at least a little bit interested? I can't be the only one who's curious. Right? She gnawed at her lip, shrugging. They could hear footsteps faintly down the hall as Yamada approached. No one answered her, but in the last moments before class started Bakugo let out a huff, slamming his chair down and startling them all. Not me, he said, crackles going off within closed fists. Uraraka blinked. Oh, why? Because I already know my future. And really, no one could argue with that. Hizashi's not coming? Oh. Wasn't up for it? 13? Aizawa shook his head and there wasn't anything judgmental in his gaze, just a calm acceptance of the situation and his friend's decisions. Yagi traced fingers over the back of his chair before finally pulling it out, noticing the tremble. He'd be a liar if he said he hadn't thought about skipping this meeting as well. From a practical standpoint, Nedza didn't need them here. He could relay any pertinent information later, but he'd given it thought and come to the staggering conclusion that he was overthinking things. When push came to shove, the symbol of peace should be there for every decision, each move they made in their little chess game against All for One. And, perhaps, Yagi still felt like he had something to prove. "Here you are," Nedza murmured, sliding a hot mug of tea his way. Still the same chipper tone and smile, but Yagi caught a tension in his boss frame that wasn't normally there, something unexpected in the dip of his shoulders. The three of them were the only ones taking up space in the vast conference room. When Yagi raised the cup to drink, his movements were overly loud. "Thank you, Neds." And all at once it began. Aizawa had seen it too. Throwing back his chair with hands already pulling at his scarf, his eyes flashed momentarily red, but then everything stilled. Because what could they do? Still, Yagi found himself surging forward as well, breath coming to a stuttering halt. The hand he waved in front of Nedza's face wasn't acknowledged. His eyes had gone blank and milky white. Unseeing. Though of course, that wasn't accurate either. "How long does this normally last?" Aizawa bit out. His voice was ragged in the silence and Yagi could only shake his head. "Not long in my experience. I hope. He must be close by then." No sooner had Yagi said it than the door slid open, giving Aizawa his first glimpse of Omen in person. Yagi was glad that he and Nedza both had briefed him beforehand, because even having met the man a number of times over the years, Yagi still felt his insides bottoming out each time he did, never quite growing used to that face. Or the lack of one, really. Omen stood at nearly 7 feet and wore a simple, gray suit, a small clipping of fresh reseda always sticking out of the buttonhole. Like Yagi, Omen's limbs were long and gangly, giving him the awkward look of someone who'd never quite grown into their body. Bald, with angular, almost sunken cheeks. All of it would have made Omen someone fascinating to look at if the rest of him had simply been there. Rumors said that the man had blue eyes at birth, but they were long gone now. There was nothing but smooth flesh down past his forehead, no nose either, only a slim mouth that was stitched together with what looked like a thread made of skin. No one had ever seen Omen eat or drink, nor did he seem to breathe. Yagi watched the man's chest carefully, but if there was a rise and fall there, he couldn't detect it. Even without eyes, he moved through the world like he knew what it held for him. 4 hours now Yagi had been gearing up to shake a fellow hero's hand. Now, when it came down to it, his arm wouldn't move. Pathetic. Nedza's gasp saved him the embarrassment. He had 2 moods in Yagi's experience, unfailingly kind or gleefully maniacal, so the distressed look crossing his features was something new that Yagi filed away for later study. Nedza was bent over the table now, one paw shooting up when Aizawa made to move closer. "I'm fine," he told them, whispering it. That was rather awful, though sadly not anything useful for this meeting. "Omen." When Nedza looked up, the smile had returned, even if it was a little sickly. "It's good to see you again." No one really believed the words. Omen inclined his head though and moved to take a seat. Yagi followed, fairly collapsing back into his own chair. There were so many quirks in the world, things that deviated and contradicted and baffled scientists at every turn, but nothing was quite like this. In morbid moments such as these, Yagi sometimes wondered what it must have been like for Omen's parents, a child who lost their features and then beginning to emit this visions of the future. None of them good. Despite the word's dual meaning, it was clear that whoever had given Omen his hero name was well aware of the common usage, a foreboding glimpse of what was to come. Ill intent on the horizon. It might have been a powerful tool had Omen been able to control when and for who he prophesied, or even if he had a sense of when the visions would occur. As it was, what he and the target saw might happen in a day, a month, a year, maybe never at all, depending on the choices people made. That, more than anything, was what seemed to unnerve people. The ambiguity. Could they avoid whatever fate they'd seen? When would they know if they had? Yagi's hands dug into the material of his pants. It was information without context, a power that could cripple other heroes as easily as villains. No, the only one Omen's power was useful to was Nedzu, the sole person who could see all the threads and just maybe make use of a single puzzle piece. Even a horrible one. By now Omen had drawn out a leather journal, the same one he'd used to communicate when Yagi had seen him briefly a year before. He'd only caught sight of the cover then, and now, looking down at lists of half-conversations, Yagi was struck by how beautiful his handwriting was. You wrote in your letter that you think some of your recent visions might connect to the League of Villains? Nedzu prompted, voice sweet as honey once more. Omen nodded, bending slowly over his journal to scribble something out. Yagi leaned forward to try and make out the words, and he was sprawled out on the ground somewhere, dirt and small scrapes littering his forearms. Yagi's body ached and what little breath he had was gone, like he'd just taken a hit to the stomach, a shove, a push. He managed to look up and there was young Midoriya in front of him, his body shielding Yagi from whatever was ahead. He couldn't see his student's arms, or his right leg, only his left because it was bent backwards towards Yagi at an unnatural angle. They were a hair's breadth from one another. The green of Midoriya's costume filled Yagi's vision. He caught the exact moment the boy began to turn, glancing over his shoulder. Oh God, but he'd never seen Midoriya smile like that before. With a gasp Yagi was dumped back into the conference room, still feeling the phantom pain, the cold mud coating his arms and the stunning warmth of Midoriya's back. Choking, he scrambled a moment, latching onto the familiar faces and the weight of being here. Aizawa was once more out of his chair, this time with his eyes fully trained on Omen. Yagi saw the glint of red there and knew he couldn't have been in the vision for more than a few seconds. Yet it had felt much, much longer. You okay? Aizawa muttered. Yagi nodded hurriedly, gesturing for him to release their guest. It was rather apparent now why he'd insisted on attending this meeting. Omen only sat hunched in his seat. Carefully, as if knowing how his own quick movements might be interpreted, he raised a fist to his chest and circled it twice. Sorry. Yagi mustered up a smile. It's fine, Omen. Really? It was fine, of course. After all, it wasn't as if he hadn't seen young Midoriya with a broken leg before. They'd weathered worse and they'd get through that moment too, if it came at all. Perhaps we should hurry this along, Nedzu said. Sensible. Nothing to worry over. Yet Yagi didn't hear much for the rest of the meeting. Escaping outside was more of a relief than he would have admitted aloud. Late afternoon and the sun was still shining overhead. Yagi staggered out to the fields behind UA's main building, coughing blood into his hand and trying to remember how to breathe. Nedzu had kept the rest of the meeting short and curt, though Aizawa had still seen something as well, a horrible 2 minutes where none of them could bring him out of it. Omen's head had been bowed the whole time, reliving whatever it was Aizawa saw, and when it was finished he signed something that Yagi's basic knowledge didn't have a translation for. It didn't do much good. Logic and intent didn't matter after a while. Things became too claustrophobic, everyone just waiting until Aizawa constantly had his hands around his weapon and Yagi found himself biting at his nails, a habit he thought he'd dropped decades ago. The sky was a relief. Apparently for others too. Leaning against the building's wall, turning to continue his walk, Yagi froze in place as he caught sight of Omen, now seated on one of the benches beside the training field. He'd left before the rest of them, creating space, and clearly felt the same joy in being out in the open now. From this distance Yagi could just make out that how his head was titled back, blank face raised towards the sun. Go talk to him, you coward. Maybe Omen wanted to be left alone. Yagi didn't know much sign language. He had nothing to write with. Omen might not take kindly to someone else scribbling in his journal. The excuses were numerous and flimsy, but they bought just enough time for someone else to beat Yagi to it. He squinted at the sudden form approaching from the other side, surprised that any student was still on campus. It took a moment for the sun's glare to pass by and for Yagi to recognize. Koda? Yes, he was unmistakable now. Yagi's first urge was to rush out, but by then Omen was already doing that for him. He raised a pale hand to halt the young student's progress, no doubt wanting him to stay out of whatever his quirk's range was. Koda indeed hesitated. His large form shrank, curling around a sketchbook and pencil case. That's right. The boy liked to draw the animals around UA's borders, didn't he? He did have a talent for getting perfect models. Omen signed something Yagi didn't understand, though his body language made it clear he was shooing Koda away. Far from deterring the boy though, Koda's face positively lit up at the gestures. He scrambled to tuck his sketchbook under one arm, signing something back. Omen went still. Koda continued signing, approaching once more, and though Omen's language became more frantic, the young man didn't lessen his pace. He was almost to the bench when his body suddenly went still in a manner that Yagi was beginning to recognize. Omen immediately dropped his hands, shoulders slumping. Koda was lost in some vision for roughly a minute before he stumbled out of it. He moved forward again. Yagi didn't know who was more shocked, himself or Omen, but the man was expressing a hell of a lot of disbelief for someone without eyes or a moving mouth to do so. From this angle, Koda looked shaken, but he still plopped himself down onto the bench nonetheless, signing something that had Omen rearing back. He made a curt gesture. Koda shook his head. Another, the same, more forceful refusal. From a distance there were parallels shown only to Yagi, two heroes sharing the same space, legs crossed, a journal on each lap, shy and tentative in their own ways. Then Koda did what Yagi had been unable to do. Koda held out his hand for a shake. And Omen took it. Slow and hesitant, yes, but out of all the things people had called him, coward wasn't one of them. Yagi watched with his mouth hanging open. He observed the one gesture in all this that he truly understood and felt a kind of peace settling in the center of his chest. Moving backwards, careful not to be seen, Yagi left them with a smile on his face, the first in hours. And they dared to call him the greatest hero. Okay, here's one. What's the worst shit you ever pulled as a kid? With your quirk, I mean. Kirishima grinned down the lunch table, raising a hand and hardening it from fingers to wrist. See, I was a bit crazy back then. Then, Jiro said, sipping at her juice. And I figured, hey wow. I'm hard as a rock. I'm a rock. Basically. That must mean I'm indestructible, yeah? Rocks aren't indestructible, Izuku murmured. No one seemed to hear him though except Koda, who realized where this was going first, frantically shaking his head before ducking down under one arm. Kirishima just grinned all the wider. So yeah, I'm 5, dumb, and I like to test things. Great combination. My dad, he's super into crafts and stuff, right? And he has this ancient paper press down in his workshop, one with these super heavy boards that you can crank together with a lever. I've heard enough, Yaoyorozu snapped. She slapped a hand over Kirishima's mouth to keep him from saying any more. What managed to escape was a delighted laugh. Honestly, didn't you pay any attention in kindergarten? Our quirks develop with age, just like the rest of us. So you smile though. She leaned forward, a little overly eager. So how many fingers did you break, Kirishima? He escaped Yaoyorozu long enough to say over her arm, all of them. Crushed like fine powder. They had to take me to a special healer. Enough. As Yaoyorozu worked on beating Kirishima with her bread, Ida gave a delicate cough, pushing his glasses back into place. Though it seems foolish now, I suppose we were all like that as children. I too had many moments where I used my quirk irresponsibly. Why, I recall one time where I hadn't quite figured out how to stop yet and, well, Mrs. Izumi's flower beds were never the same after that. And I, eventually stopped with the help of a wall. Uraraka was giggling madly into her hands as Ojiro cast Ida an unimpressed look. So what you're saying is the worst thing you ever did was stuff every kid does? Certainly not. Destroying flower beds and running into things? Come on, Ida. Ashido had a whole bunch of greens sticking out of her mouth, but she was pointing madly at Ida and nodding. When she managed to swallow the mouthful, she reached up to clap him on the shoulder. You're a goody-goody, she said happily. I used my acid to skate off the roof once, fell through a hole I made during a temper tantrum, burned holes in my mom's clothes when I was mad at her, slipped a little acid into this asshole girl's soup. Most of the class was looking at her with horror. That's not legal? Izuku cried, but Tsuyu seemed rather pleased. I had an asshole boy, she said, tapping at her chin. One day I regurgitated my stomach into his lap at recess. He wasn't an asshole anymore. There was silence around the table. Oh, Ida murmured. Kirishima gave her 2 thumbs up. After a moment Koda joined in. A shaky, Embarrassed bit of signing told them that he too had set animals on a bully once. Kaminari nudged him hard in the ribs. Come on dude, spill. What kind? Just as slowly Koda fingerspelled, and when they caught it half the table groaned. Cockroaches, Yaoyorozu threw down her napkin. And I've officially lost my appetite. Aren't you afraid of bugs? Koda's shrug said it all. Desperate times, desperate measures. Ojiro shook his head. I'm actually a complete hypocrite. I was a goody-goody too. Worst thing I ever did? He stared down at his lunch, considering. I mean, I smacked a few people with my tail, sure, but beyond that? Worst thing was the embarrassment. Ojiro suddenly grinned, a sloppy thing that was half sheepish, half fond. Mom and Dad couldn't always afford altered clothes, so I usually just kept my tail tucked down one side of my pant leg. It grew pretty fast though and had a tendency to put strain on the garment. Please tell me there's a picture of baby you out there with his pants split, Siro whispered. There are multiple pictures, I'm sure. Uraraka held up a finger. Don't mind me. I'm just going to make a note to check up on that later. You're shameless, Ida cried. You already knew that? If she's shameless then I'm shameless too, Jiro said, quite literally writing a reminder down in her planner. Yaoyorozu stared at her in utter defeat. Hardly. I was a good girl, she sniffed. I went to school, studied chemical composition, and never made anything I wasn't supposed to. Hagakure leaned forward for the first time. A floating spoon pointed sharply at Yaoyorozu. Liar. You told me you made jewelry for a whole month once. They were gifts. Was it though? Was it really? I mean, I snuck into all sorts of places. I don't think it's anything to be ashamed of. It's a part of learning and growing up, and... The spoon waved a bit. Something meaningful, I guess. You guess? Ashido asked, but Hagakure was already distracted by Tsuyu's untended dessert. Jiro lifted her glass. We should have some fun every once in a while. I used to eavesdrop on conversations all the time. Didn't hurt anyone in the long run, and a bit of gossip is good for the soul. She smirked, downing her drink. You can catch me listening in 24/7? Tokoyami shook his head. I'm with Yaoyorozu on this one. Our quirks should be handled responsibly. What we did as children can't be undone, but now, as UA students, we are looked upon as role models, and we should behave accordingly. Ida's karate chop down on the table made all the silverware rattle. He nodded furiously. Are you crying? Uraraka whispered. You only say that because your quirk isn't good for mischief, Kaminari said, shaking a fist. I should know. Only thing I managed to do was blow out my block's electricity for 3 days. That's not fun, that's boring. You're boring no matter what you do, Jiro said and had to dodge the crackers Kaminari threw at her face. Well, I have faith in Todoroki and Uraraka at least, Yaoyorozu said primly. She straightened a little in her seat. You two never did anything awful, right? There was silence on both ends of the table. Oh God, what did you do? They both opened their mouths to speak, spotted the other, went quiet again. After another awkward few seconds, Uraraka shooed at Todoroki to go first. He shrugged. The blizzard 5 years ago, he said. That seemed to be all he was willing to offer. Kirishima leaned forward, poking him in the arm. Dude. The one that shut down the city for, like, a week. Todoroki shrugged again. I was dealing with a lot that winter. The pokes turned into surprisingly kind pats. You gave us so many snow days, Ashido said reverently. There were considering nods all around. Uraraka was the only one not staring at Todoroki with either fear or awe in their eyes. She'd buried her face in her hands instead, cheeks a cherry red. Izuku chuckled. He tried to peek between her fingers. What did you do? I don't want to say. Come on. It can't be as bad as the stuff Bakugo pulled when we were kids. He blew up the gym once. That seemed to comfort her a bit. Uraraka gave a weary sigh, reappearing to stare down at her plate instead. The first thing she muttered was so soft none of them caught it. What was that? I said I sent our neighbor's cat into space. Uraraka snapped her mouth shut, managing to go even redder in the cheeks. Accidentally, she hurried to clarify. I was petting him and made him weightless and I didn't know how to release yet and she flapped her hands, returning to hide behind them as her feet stomped instead. A very faint, I'm so sorry, could be heard. Holy hell, Infinity Girl, Kirishima whispered and Tokoyami jabbed him in the ribs. What about you, Midoriya? Ida asked. He was casting Uraraka worried looks, trying to move the conversation away from childhood traumas. Surely with your incredible strength you got into all sorts of mischief? Yeah, Kaminari said slowly. You're such a mess every time you fight. I'm surprised you didn't die as a kid. How many bones did you break anyway? Way more than Kirishima, I bet. Tsuyu was nodding. That couldn't have been easy, Midoriya. Though I suspect that your similar quirks increased your respect for All Might, yes. Hey, I bet that's why you latched onto him. Besides being the #1 hero, of course. Half the table voiced their opinions as Izuku slid down in his seat. There wasn't anywhere to hide though, and within seconds his friends were turning back to him, demanding the kind of story from his childhood that he just didn't have. What was he supposed to tell them? That he'd once jumped off the jungle gym thinking he might fly? Or nearly drowned seeing if he could breathe underwater? For a long time Izuku had been unable, flat out incapable, of taking the doctor at his word, and that had led to a long period of rather dangerous experimentation, trying desperately to find his hidden quirk, something that he just knew needed the right environment to become apparent. It didn't happen, of course. Within 3 years his mom was a nervous wreck and all Izuku had were his journals and a small collection of scars. His friends though, their stories were funny because they were normal, the kind of mistakes that quirk kids really did make, the things you looked back on with glee once it was over. Despite having a quirk now, Izuku wasn't so sure that his memories had suddenly become joyous. He slid even further down in his seat, bowing under all the stares. Though he hated to do it, Izuku had resigned himself to coming up with a little white lie, when a heavy hand fell on his shoulder. Strength? I had that beat from day one. My poor mom and dad had permanent hearing loss by the time I was 2. Izuku looked up. Mike and Aizawa had suddenly appeared to hover over their group, books tucked under one arm while their right hands hung free. It had become standard procedure since USJ for the teachers to make rounds throughout the day, crossing students' paths out on the grounds, in the halls or the cafeteria. This was the first time Izuku had seen them join a conversation though. Present Mick's smiling face was directly above his head and the hand on his shoulder, solid and a little tight, conveyed that everything, even the small things, were all right now. He reminded Izuku strongly of All Might in that moment. Or perhaps it was the other way around. Regardless, his friends were instantly enthralled. Ida leaned forward over the table, his eyes a little buggy behind his glasses. You were born with your quirk, sensei? That's rare. And perhaps, unfortunate? Mike finished. He finger-gunned at the lot of them, nodding. Sure it was. Course, I was just a little tyke who couldn't help myself. All babies cry, am I right? But oh boy, all that screaming. I brought the house down even as a babe, literally. Mike posed for them, causing a handful of giggles to ripple over the group. Aizawa just stared at him with distaste. You never stopped screaming, he muttered. Nope. Hey, at least I'm honest about it. This guy pulled all sorts of shit in school, not that he'll admit to it now. Aizawa's eye twitched as Mike threw an arm over his shoulders. Oh? So you're saying you didn't convince half our classmates that they were somehow losing their quirks? Or what was it? Mike stared up at the ceiling, considering. That's right. I recall a certain curious second year trying his quirk out on himself with the help of a mirror. How long did the migraines last again? 2 weeks. Aizawa's expression was mostly unreadable, though Izuku thought he caught the slightest upturn to his lips. There were no migraines. Course there weren't. It was the final boost he needed. Hagakure seemed to be standing up now, her uniform floating over Ciro's head as she tried to get Mick's attention, babbling that she'd been born with her quirk too and her parents had lost her a bunch. Isn't that funny? The girls' voices rose as they demanded more of that story while Tokoyami led the boys in trying to interrogate Aizawa, without making it seem like that was exactly what they were doing. Eventually Mike just pulled up a chair, shoving Aizawa into another, and Izuku finally felt himself relaxing again. And near the end of the lunch hour there a moment, a small one, where Aizawa caught his eye. This time there was definitely a smile. Thanks. This was getting out of hand. For once Aizawa seemed to be in total agreement with him, scowling out over the small sea of reporters, his hands twitching like they wanted to grab hold of his scarf. Granted, he always looked like he was on the negative end of the emotional spectrum, but Yagi had known the man long enough to spot the subtle differences: lanker hair, a restlessness in his legs. He'd heard the jokes going around that Yamada had wanted to treat the last pack of journalists like trespassing villains. Give Aizawa another 5 minutes and he might just do it. Yagi held up placating hands. If it also allowed him to act as a barrier between the reporters and his exhausted colleague, all the better. Please, he said. The school day will be starting any moment. This really isn't the time to be. It's never the time with you lot, a woman accused. She just towed the line of UA's barrier, her microphone held high like a weapon, ready to snatch up any wayward comments they might drop. You wouldn't let us speak with all might when he first began teaching here, and now that he's fought on school grounds you're still denying us a comment? She planted her heels. The public has a right to know what happened in the USJ facility. Who exactly is this league? What are their motives? Are you pleased with your decision to hire All Might? You, sir, were those injuries sustained during the battle? Yagi felt Aizawa twitching behind him. He tried to fully block his friend from the cameras. All Might will give a statement later, he said firmly. Not while school is in session. Or rather, he'd give a statement when he was capable of appearing. If Yagi had been able he would have left and returned within moments, allowing All Might to field any questions while Aizawa escaped to class, but a late-night villain, too close to his apartment for Yagi to ignore, had ate up his time for today. The irony, of course, was inescapable. Here these people were clamoring for All Might, completely unaware that he was right in front of them, the rail-thin man who they passed their gaze over, dismissive. None of them had even asked his name or what Yagi supposedly taught here. He wasn't sure if he was grateful. Ah, you there, students? One reporter's cry was picked up by the others, and this time Yagi had to physically restrain Aizawa as he surged forward, a rather insulting string of words emanating from under his breath. Hand on his arm, Yagi could feel how tired he was, how much pain he must still be in, and this, more than anything, had the ability to rile him up. Aizawa had always looked upon the media frenzy with distaste. Like hell would he let it descend upon his students. Yagi couldn't agree more. Someday soon there would be training for situations just like these, but not today. The kids didn't need this right now. Take them to class, he murmured. I'll handle this. I'll handle it. It was the sort of phrase that normally would have had Aizawa side-eyeing him in a manner capable of causing Yagi to cower. Now though he just seemed too grateful to care whether he could, in fact, handle a mob of reporters as Toshinori. Maybe Yagi should have been insulted. Or at least a little annoyed. He just felt relief though, watching Aizawa quickly herd most of 1A away from the main entrance. Yagi briefly caught Izuku's eye and gave him a wave. The one he got back sent warmth blazing through his chest. Oh come on. The woman who'd been accosting them finally lowered her microphone. At least let us talk to the survivors. Yagi focused a sharp look her way. She actually took a step back. I don't appreciate your word choice. You should all leave. Your presence isn't helping the students recover from what, I can only imagine, was a rather traumatizing event. The woman had the gall to actually scoff at him. She gestured at 1A in the distance. I don't see any of them crying about it. They can answer a few questions. It won't kill them, which was when the delicate cough sounded behind him. UA's barrier ensured that there was always a few feet between the teachers and the media, and the barrier extended just enough that a person could stand behind the edge on the inside, hidden from view. When Yagi slid his gaze over there was, sure enough, one straggler hiding in the barrier's shadow. Young Ashido? She was leaning casually, examining her nails and looking for all the world like she was just out for a laid-back stroll. It made her next, whispered words all the stranger, entirely disconnected from her appearance. Hey, did you know that I can cry on command? And before Yagi could even begin processing that, Ashido began to howl. The reporters stumbled back en masse as she rounded the corner, voice pitched high and loud as her eyes immediately welled up with tears. Yagi was equally stunned, trying to follow this turn of events as Ashido gripped at her hair. She swayed a little, quite literally shrieking, big fat tears rolling off her cheeks in waves. Why are you all so mean? She cried, causing the woman to gap unbecomingly. We just got back and it was so scary and we thought we were gonna die and now you. She cut off with a particularly awful wail, throwing herself into Yagi's arms. He dug his legs in to keep standing. Goodness, the girl was sturdy, and instinctually moved to pat her head, the other curling around her shoulders. Yagi could feel Ishido soaking the front of his shirt, long, hiccuping sobs echoing in the morning air. It didn't escape his or the reporter's notice how young she appeared in this moment. Tiny legs trembled and she curled closer like he was the only thing left to protect her. Yagi had just enough brain power left to glare over the top of her head. It wasn't hard. As I said, I think you should leave. And thank Mina Ishido, they actually did. The second they were out of range, Ishido lifted her head, sniffing loudly and wiping carefully at her eyes. Amazingly, her makeup still seemed to be in order. She beamed at his expression. Told you. Crying is easy. Did it all the time as a kid. Hey wait, who are you again? I've seen you around here, but… Yagi said dumbly. Cool. Nice to meet you, Yagi-sensei. You ever need me to scare off some more reporters, just let me know. You looked a little out of your depth there, and I'm training to be a hero, aren't I? The light punch she aimed at his arm brought a smile back to his face. Indeed. Thank you, Ishido. If there's anything I can do… Yeah. How about a note? Aizawa is gonna kick my ass for being late. That he could most assuredly provide, and if in the note Yagi invited Aizawa to have lunch with him in the lounge today, that was only because he suddenly had a story to share. A knock on his door at 8 p.m. was a rare occurrence. So rare, in fact, that Aizawa grabbed his scarf and goggles from the couch before approaching the door. There were, total, perhaps 6 people who knew where he lived, none of which were in the habit of making unexpected house calls. If there was an emergency of some kind, Aizawa would have gotten an alert on his phone. If the power was out or the lines down, Nedzu would use one of his many contacts with an electrical quirk to push through it. If that wasn't possible, he'd call Akemi instead, a quick burst of telepathy to draw all heroes to a central location. There was no family to show up on his doorstep, he'd never spoken with the neighbors, there were certainly no packages this late in the day. By the time Aizawa had his hand on the door, he'd convinced himself that there was nothing good waiting for him behind the wood. In a way, he was right. And wrong. 13, he muttered. Aizawa let his quirk drop. What the hell? It was hard to tell with the helmet, but 13 kind of looked like they too would like to know what the hell. They hunched protectively over a small box in their arms, the suit's gloves hiding the contents from view, and at Aizawa's words 13 began shifting from foot to foot, agitated. I'm so very sorry to bother you at home, they said. Truly I am, but Ishiyama doesn't have the softest touch and I love the man truly, but I wouldn't trust Yamada with this as far as I can throw him, and poor Yagi is still just getting settled and I couldn't possibly impose. A dim part of Aizawa's mind noted that he, apparently, could be imposed upon, but he was more interested in the fact that 13 was rambling. They'd always been long-winded, but he'd never heard them run their mouth without context before. It was a waste of time and he finally just raised a hand for silence, leaning forward to peer into the box. The most bedraggled kitten he'd ever seen looked back at him. As light blue eyes tried staring him down, Aizawa remembered that inviting someone in was usually customary, especially when it was freezing as fuck outside. He pointed. Can you safely take off your boots? Yes. Then do it. And Aizawa marched back inside, leaving the door wide open. It made a strange sort of sense once 13 explained. In fact, the logic was so simple that Aizawa kicked himself for not realizing it sooner. 13 was a rescue hero. Not everyone survived the disasters they appeared at, despite their best intentions. And the dead left behind plenty of pets. It's always chaos, 13 said, sitting primly on Aizawa's couch. They fiddled with one of the flips on their fingers in a manner that was both endearing and rather unnerving. Of course, everyone is worried about human lives first, I hardly blame them for that, and many of the pets run off if they manage to escape, poor things scared out of their minds. If they come back and if there are relatives willing to take them in, well, that's alright then. So many of the owners live alone though. I'd take the deers in myself, but… 13 extended a hand into the box and the ball of matted fur immediately hissed, a tiny claw coming out for an attack. They sighed. Animals have never taken to me much. At all, if I'm frank. It's as if they know that I... 13 made a vague motion at their body. Wary of insulting them, Aizawa deliberately didn't look down at their feet. I quite envy Koda at times. Aizawa listened to all this with an indifferent expression. Pound, he said. He wasn't sure how he knew, but 13 was definitely scowling now. Oh, I sent the deers there for years. Plenty of different ones throughout the city too, just so none would get overbooked. You know what they do to the poor ones that don't find homes. He wasn't stupid. Aizawa could take a wild guess. People wanted pedigree pets and Pounds wanted their resources. Neither of these things worked well together. Aizawa crossed the room to peer into the box again. He didn't need to ask what kind of disaster it had been tonight. Fired was written all over the runt's face, literally in ash and smoke stains, and to be frank, 13 still smelled strongly of smoke themselves. The kitten's actual physique was lost under all the grime and Aizawa felt a familiar urge to clean. Himself he didn't care about much. Everything else though. A young cat should be popular, yeah? 13 was already nodding. Yes. I actually found this little one in the alley behind the blaze, caught among some of the smaller fires that broke out. He seems to be in good health from what I can tell and his paws don't appear burned. I should be able to find a home for him fairly quickly. He just needs a temporary place to stay. Aizawa blinked. I don't have any food. Toys and shit. I can provide you with some. What if he dies while I'm out on patrol? Cats are remarkably self-sufficient. I'm allergic. 13 paused. I didn't realize. They reached for the box when Aizawa's hand shot out. Didn't say I wouldn't take him, he muttered. Besides, my eyes are already shit. Technically Aizawa couldn't tell when 13 was scowling or glancing away, pursing their lips. None of that was available to him, and normally Aizawa hated people he couldn't read. Yet somehow, once again, he knew exactly what they were doing behind that mask. 13 left his apartment with a smile on their face. Quit squirming. Huh. Aizawa scowled at his cell. Not you, Hizashi. Ashes. You named the fire cat Ashes? He's fucking covered in them, of course I'm naming him Ashes. Have you ever named something before? No wait, I forgot which handsome, gorgeous, incredibly talented man gave you your hero name. My mistake. Aizawa felt like he should respond to that, but he was a little busy wrestling Ashes back into the sink, soap suds flying across his previously clean countertops. The little beast was a menace alright, howling like Aizawa was torturing him rather than just trying to give the asshole a goddamn bath. 15 minutes in and all he'd managed to accomplish was scaring up his hands even worse than they already were. Aizawa scowled at the thin run of blood threading through the water. Hizashi had gone uncharacteristically quiet. When his voice came again it was shaking with amusement. Are you killing the thing, Shoyuta? Nearly, Aizawa growled and shoved Ashes back into the water. I need you to pick up some stuff. Me? Hey, there was a building collapse. 13 is busy. He'd heard it on the news not an hour after 13 had left, knowing damn well they wouldn't be getting back anytime tonight, and maybe not tomorrow. Aizawa sure wasn't leaving this cat unsupervised. Also he'd already changed into his pajamas. Things I do for you, not all of us are hermits on a Saturday night. I was on my way out, thank you, not to a pet store. Are they even open right now? Ugh, I guess some of the supermarket chains go until 10. You will be paying me back though, right? Because I'm not dropping a fortune just because you've taken in a reflection of your soul. Which I mean is black, mean, creepy. Are you still talking? There was some indistinct grumbling over the line before it finally went dead. In the sudden silence Aizawa could more clearly hear the low, distasteful sounds that Ashes was making. He'd finally settled down though, smart enough to realize that Aizawa was bigger, stronger, and far more stubborn, so he was able to wash the rest of the grime away without too much fuss, revealing soft fur beneath his hands. Ashes was entirely gray, with light spots that Aizawa thought would become more prominent once he was dry. He still had those clear blue eyes and an expression that said he'd very much like to eat his new caretaker. Aizawa smirked. Try it, he said and got a furious yowl for his trouble. Still, some sort of understanding seemed to pass between them. It was when the fighting broke out again that Aizawa discovered that Ashes was, in fact, a girl. Hisashi dumped the essentials on Aizawa's doorstep 2 hours later, making it his busiest social night since high school. 13 returned on Sunday in a slight panic, bearing duplicates, apologies, and a hamster. Aizawa just stared a little dumbly at the brown blob in his woodchip home. Ashes was splayed across his boot, devoting her entire attention to massacring his ankle. Aizawa shifted weight, shook his leg a little, and she made a sound like a small motorbike about to crash. "This isn't a menagerie," Aizawa said, but he took the hamster in and placed him near the old radiator so he wouldn't get cold. This, he realized, was what happened when you were a good person. He should have kept his door shut that night, because after that 13 kept bringing him animals. More cats, a few dogs, turtles, snakes, rabbits, and one other cat that was definitely a feral fox. True to their word, they always found homes for the little menaces, and Aizawa only spent a slight fortune on allergy meds alongside his eye drops. He supposed it wasn't the worst arrangement in the world. Maybe. There was just one tiny catch. 13 never found a home for Ashes. Or if they did, they shut that shit down fast. "I didn't know you had pets, sensei." Uraraka gushed it, hanging over the back of the bus seat with the rest of 1A crowded around her, trying to get a look at the small screen. Kirishima had lifted his cell phone a few minutes before and Aizawa was too tired to stop him. Plus it hadn't been a bad pickpocketing attempt for his first try. If looking at his photo gallery kept them busy for the rest of the ride back to Yue, he'd be lucky indeed. Or maybe not. If Ishida would just stop shrieking. "They're not mine," Aizawa muttered, sliding further down in his seat. "I just keep them until 13 finds new homes. It's temporary." The normal chatter started back up again, and for just a moment Aizawa thought he was free, until his damn problem child put that analytical mind of his to work. His cell was dropped back in front of his face, Izuku pointing to a pic of Ashes balanced up on his shoulders, claws embedded into his hair. That had been taken right after she'd attempted to shred his scarf and nearly broken her nails instead. Any fool could see that those devil eyes weren't just a byproduct of the camera's flash. "What about this one, sir? He has a collar?" "Ashes," he muttered, causing a wave of happy gasps to ripple through the class. "No one has taken her yet. She's too much trouble. And too stubborn to understand the word temporary. Kinda like the idiot children at his back." Funny how Aizawa didn't seem to mind either as much as he should have. "Dear All Might, I hope you don't mind me writing you. I'll admit that it's forward of me, but I have my doubts that you'll ever even see this. Principal Nedzu swore that he would pass this letter on, and maybe he will. He seems like a nice enough fellow, or maybe he was just humoring another worried mom. So I'll be sorry if you don't see this, and I'll be sorry if you do. I'm sorry I'm not much of a writer, a rambler, my father always said, and I'm sorry that I'm already taking up too much of your time. Sometimes it feels like I'm made up of nothing but apologies. One caused a lot of trouble years back and I've been thinking about it lately. Consequences, I'd never realized before just how awful an I'm sorry could be. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Inko Midoriya and my son is now one of your students at UA. Do you know him? Maybe not. I'm sure there are lots of fantastic, inspiring children in those halls. More than enough to catch your eye. But maybe you remember the green-haired boy you saved a few months back from a sludge villain in the downtown shopping district? I wouldn't fault you if you don't. You've saved so many lives there's no way you could remember them all. But that was my Izuku. You saved him, All Might, and no matter how many times you've heard it said by others, even if it seems stupid receiving it now, I need you to hear it from me too. Thank you. Thank you for bringing him home. I said I'm not good at words and I'm really not. Literature was never a talent of mine and I honestly can't remember the last time I wrote a letter. I don't know how to express the things I'm feeling on paper, so frankly I won't even try. I'll just be blunt with you. I want to say thank you for my son's life, and I want to ask you for one more thing. Because I'm selfish, All Might. Maybe all mothers are, I don't know. But I'm going to ask you for more anyway. Because I have to. Please learn who my Izuku is. I'm not asking that you give him the world, except maybe I am, because from you even a single glance would be the world, the whole galaxy, really. Do you have any idea how much he looks up to you? Yes, I'm sure everyone says that about their children. Who doesn't love All Might? He's the world's favorite hero and everyone is his biggest fan. I'm sure there are thousands just like my Izuku who poured love onto your websites, collected all your toys, vowed to be just like you someday. Maybe there are even others who had you as a father figure in their household, and you didn't know that, did you? Of course you didn't, how could you? But my husband has been gone a long time, All Might, and I couldn't have asked for a better substitute in helping to raise my boy. Eat your vegetables, Izuku. Don't you want to grow up strong like your hero? Be kind to others, Izuku. What would All Might do? All I ever needed was your name and Izuku would morph into a perfect little angel. Maybe that really was due to your influence, or maybe it's just his nature. I don't claim to know that either. All I do know is that despite all the other kids out there who watched All Might interviews and wore All Might onesies to bed, my boy is different, and I guess every mother says that too. But I swear it's the truth. So if you're willing to believe me then please, give him something. Give him anything at all. Call on him in class and praise his answer. Greet him in the hall and remember his name. A pat on the shoulder, a wink, a smile. You'll give him plenty of smiles, won't you, All Might? I know you will, but I'm scared that it won't be enough. Because you see, my Izuku is fragile. He might not seem it when that spirit of his takes hold, but he's the sort of sensitive boy who's worn down by things over time. Slowly, he'll shrug off every insult, push through every obstacle, but with each challenge he gains a tiny wound that he won't acknowledge, that just eats at him until, I'm afraid, it will one day tear him apart. I worry because I gave him a wound of my own years ago. I didn't mean to, but I did, and I've come to realize that you, All Might, are the only person left in his life who hasn't hurt him. Silly, right? How can you hurt a boy you don't even know? But you could. Easily. Because you smile for everyone, everywhere, and when a gift is shared that widely, well, it doesn't seem very special anymore, does it? You could brush off my boy's worship, treat him like all the other fans, and though you would be entirely justified in doing so, I'm afraid of the consequences that might have. Izuku wants nothing more in this world than to be a hero like you, to be a hero for you, but so many people have been against him that he needs a salve maybe, a special something that's all his own. You could give him that. Frankly, right now you're the only one who could. It might not be fair to provide my boy with any special treatment, but frankly I don't give a damn about fair anymore. Pretend for just a moment that Izuku's devotion is unique. Be a father to a son you never asked for, even if it's only while passing him in the hall. Give Izuku a smile that's for him and him alone. Do something because just 30 seconds of your time could mean a whole boy's life. Surely that's not too much for one mother to ask for? Or maybe it is. If so, please accept my most humble apologies. And if it's not, then thank you. Thank you again. And I'm sorry. Sincerely, Inko Midoriya. Dear Ms. Midoriya, I've started this letter 7 times now. To avoid an 8th, I've decided to simply copy your format by offering an introduction, a story, and an apology. Though I'll start with that last one first. I'm not the man you wrote to and I'm not who you wanted to hear back from, so for that I am truly, exceedingly sorry. My name is Toshinori Yagi and I am an assistant of All Might's. No, you wouldn't have heard of me. I handle the more mundane aspects of All Might's media persona, the sort of stuff befitting a simple, quirkless man. But my one claim to fame is, perhaps, that I do know him better than most, well enough that I'm writing in his stead. It's because I know him well that I've asked for this task. Ma'am, with all due respect, All Might is not someone you should put your faith in, especially not when something as precious as your boy is at stake. You have no reason to take the word of a stranger, but please believe me when I say that he doesn't deserve that kind of trust. Perhaps we're a little alike? If I don't insult you by saying so. Because I'm also getting ahead of myself. The story I promised you. Once upon a time, or really just about 11 months ago, your Izuku encountered a villain on his way home from school. What I suspect you don't know though is that poor, brave Izuku encountered him twice. The first time was under a bridge a few miles east of where the documented attack took place. I won't give you a play-by-play, no mother should read such things, but in short, All Might saved your boy and they were given the chance to talk. It's something right out of a comic book, yes? The young man face to face with his idol, given a chance to finally express his awe and, I believe, ask for validation. Because isn't that what you said? That Izuku's only dream was to be a hero like All Might? To gain his approval? And here All Might stood. It's what we would expect of any good story. The young man gains encouragement from the mentor and rises to new heights, quirk or no quirk. He'd let pure determination pave the way. Except this isn't a comic book, and often people are far crueler than characters. All Might told me later that he'd said no. No, Izuku, you can't be a hero without a quirk. It's not possible. Give it up. Are you making excuses for him? I know I did. I told myself that All Might was just thinking of the boy's safety, that the world needs police officers or paramedics as much as it does heroes, all sorts of justifications to cover up the fact that he broke that boy in the span of a few words. I need you to understand this, Ms. Midoriya, completely. Izuku's hero stood in front of him and said he could not achieve his dream. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that this was the worst moment in your son's life, the exact sort of thing you fear he'd never come back from. And he charged that villain anyway. Reeling, thinking he's quirkless, shut down by the one person he'd always thought he could believe in, and Izuku was still a hero that day, regardless of what anyone said, even the great All Might. I'm telling you this not to give you more nightmares, I hope that's not the case, but because I hope it offers you some strange form of comfort. I know it does for me, knowing that Izuku has already faced his worst fear and come out the better for it. Your boy is like Kinsakuroi, Mrs. Izuku, more beautiful for having been broken. Do you hate All Might now? I wouldn't blame you if you did. I've given his callous words a lot of thought the past few months, and yes, I think I hate him too. At least a little. Because All Might has become exactly what this world needs, a symbol of peace, but symbols can't take care of children. They need more than just a smile and a glittering thumbs up. At least, I'm beginning to think so. You're forward? Forgive me, Ms. Midoriya, but not at all. At least not compared to me. Because I'd like to ask you a favor in return. Perhaps, just maybe, you'd consider allowing me to watch over your boy in All Might's stead? I know we don't know one another, and in a better world I'd have more to offer you than my own inadequacies, a frail body, a quirkless existence, a teaching job that I'm learning as I go, but perhaps those things will resonate with Izuku. At least, I'm desperate enough to hope that they would. Because I already love him, Ms. Midoriya. I'm not at all the father figure you gave him in his youth, but then I never planned to have a son of my own. Who plans for such a glorious prince of nonsense to drop straight into an old man's life anyway? He's taken up that position whether you or I or even Izuku himself wants it, so I figure I might as well make the best of an impossible situation. I'll look out for him. For whatever it's worth, he has my protection. And as a further reassurance, it's not just me. My goodness, but wouldn't our children be in trouble if they could only count on us? If he hasn't spoken of them already, you should ask Izuku about young Uraraka and Ida, 2 other students in his class. They've guarded your son's heart since day one, with a devotion that us adults can only hope to follow. Let them carry some of the weight. Izuku will be happier and stronger with them at his side. That's how you're meant to end letters, right? With peace and optimism? Maybe. I'm not any better at this than you are, but perhaps we can muddle through it together. Izuku had extra training today. I canceled it and sent him home early with this letter instead. Please enjoy your night together. With the deepest respect and fondness for you both, Toshinori Yagi. P.S. I've left the blood and tear stains on version number 7. It's unsightly, but they might say more than my words ever could. At least I hope they do. Yagi. A whistle sounded and then there was chaos across UA's field. The game was a simple one of Aizawa's design. Fight until you couldn't fight anymore. There were no flimsy strings of capture tape, or arbitrary boundaries like the sports festival had. Oh, they all had to stay on the massive field, but that was more of a safety measure than anything else. Aizawa had brought in an old colleague of his, a bubbly woman with multicolored hair and a laugh that sounded downright wrong next to their sour-faced teacher, whose quirk allowed her to produce incredible defensive shields around the field's perimeter. Today there were no civilians to watch out for, no buildings to try and keep standing, no missions, no teams, and above all no rules. No escape either. Victory was granted to the last student standing. If you passed beyond the field, you simply hit a jello-like wall and were thrown in again. Back into the game. Izuku loved it. He'd started on the left side of the field's edge next to Shiro, Hagakure, Ida, and Tokoyami, the rest of his classmates scattered into 5 groups on the other 3 sides. Directly across from him were Todoroki and Bakugo, their hands already glowing with fire and ice. Izuku knew who his real competition was, and he also knew not to underestimate anyone else. This was going to be fun. Begin, he'd heard, the screech of Aizawa's whistle, and then everything around him exploded. Luckily, Izuku was already in the air. Holy shit, Shiro said, but by then Izuku was halfway across the field, grinning all the while. Keep calm, keep steady. Stay at 5%. Watch your footing and dodge. It was easier than he'd first thought it would be. Gran Torino's training really had been perfect for these new exercises, except that now Izuku actually had the space he needed to make use of one for all. The combination of strength rushing through his limbs, the afterimage of Gran Torino's nimble, shockingly fast movements, and a whole field to make use of sent a heady rush through Izuku's head, the likes of which he wasn't sure he'd experienced before. He felt like he could leap 100 feet right now, farther even than All Might maybe, and Izuku hoped he was watching closely. Because he wanted to impress him. If he could. Deku. No time for thoughts like those though. He'd already reached his classmates. Sorry, Izuku mouthed and jumped left just as Bakugo's familiar right hook put a small, burning crater into the grass. It was the sort of move that normally would have put him off balance, if he hadn't pushed directly off Ishido's shoulder when he landed. She was a lot thinner than a building's wall, a moving stepstone too, but Izuku stuck it and grinned with abandon as she face-planted with a shriek, Kirishima taking the opportunity to knock her out cold. For a brief moment her still form sent a sick feeling shooting through Izuku's stomach, but he pushed it firmly away. Aizawa had warned them about this. All Might had too. There was a time and place for practicing teamwork among heroes, but this wasn't that kind of fight. Everyone should do their absolute best and hold back only when it came to doing permanent damage. Recovery Girl would take care of the rest. So Izuku grit his teeth, landed, pivoted, and made a beeline in the opposite direction. Behind him he could hear Kaken's screams of rage, tempered only by the fact that he had Kirishima, Tsuyu, and Ojiro ganging up on him now. It seemed that everyone had the same thought about which two should be taken out of the fight first. Half his classmates had converged on Bakugo in an instant, while the other half had surrounded Todoroki. And Todoroki was coming for him. Smile, Izuku thought and kept his grin in place even as a wall of ice shot his way. It was easy enough to dodge, he'd certainly had enough practice, but Izuku wasn't blind to the fact that Todoroki was trying to close him in. Behind him Sato and Koda both attempted to make use of Todoroki's distraction to get into close range, punches raised, faces grim, and quickly found themselves frozen top to bottom. That wasn't the way to fight him. Aoyama had better sense, letting off a long rang blast that took the tops off of Todoroki's walls and had them all wincing as wicked shards rained down. Izuku was shielding his head with his hands when he felt the slightest tingle along the back of his neck, a raising of the hair on his arms. Ice is a bad conductor, his brain said, and Izuku leapt onto the now flat surface of the wall just as Kaminari's electricity shot across the whole field. Jiro convulsed, her ear jack jammed into the ground and only halfway out. Next to her, limbs grabbing her shoulders for a throw, Shoji jerked as well. Yaoyorozu had almost succeeded in making another of her blankets. Almost. Izuku caught a glimpse of Kaminari's now slack face before everything set into motion again. Facing Izuku's blind spot, Todoroki hadn't been at all surprised by Kaminari's attack, and he'd used that brief moment between his own escape and everyone else's to build 2 more walls of ice, a third shooting across and out from where Izuku currently crouched, forcing him back down lest he get caught in the cold. Now there was a near-perfect square surrounding him, Izuku caught between Todoroki and the field's barrier. He'd counted on this. Todoroki had a bad habit of just entrapping his opponents. And Bakugo had an equally bad habit of hunting him down. Izuku revved up one for all enough that the electricity could be seen even through layers of ice, got his back against the barrier on his left, egged Todoroki just a little closer. Izuku saw that he saw what was about to happen a moment before it did. With an explosion that shook their bones, fire blasted through ice as Bakugo tried to take him out by breaking down the wall with a single kick, shrieking something about Izuku ignoring him. He wasn't, of course. Far from it. Izuku had held still just so Bakugo would come to this very spot and create an opening. But of course, he'd never promised to stay still. He laughed as he got out of their way, Bakugo's kick taking him directly into Todoroki's punch. Neither had time to pull back, and the resulting power crash sent a shockwave over the field, hitting Izuku in midair and slamming him back to the other side. He could easily hear Bakugo's screams of rage. They sounded a little shivery, but now there were new things to worry about. "Hey Uraraka," Izuku said. She gave him a thumbs up. And then Uraraka tried to drop a ridiculous amount of dirt on his head. It might have just been what she had to work with, Bakugo's earlier hits kicking up clumps of grass instead of dealing boulders like at the sports festival, but a dim part of Izuku's brain reminded him that she was way smarter than that. Smart enough for this to be a distraction rather than an attack. There were times, rare ones, when Izuku felt like everything was slowing down, like the universe had descended to a crawl just to give him enough time to think. This was one of those times, where he had the sense that a god, if such a being actually existed, had pushed a slow-motion button on all their lives, allowing Izuku to angle until he saw past the mess of dirt to find Uraraka charging at him. Kirishima coming in from his right, a faint explosion in his ears that was far fainter than Bakugo's, so, Ida's engines, and the patter of small feet, the smallest in their class. The timing had to be perfect. Izuku grit his teeth and pivoted, making as if to meet Kirishima's punch head-on, feinting at the very last second. It meant that Ida didn't have time to stop his own attack from behind. Plowing into solid, sentient rock must hurt. Note to self, all of us need practice in stopping momentum. Uraraka tripping into the mess of balls Mineta had laid out for him was just an added bonus. Her shriek of rage when she instinctually put her hands out to break her fall, thus rendering them useless. Second note to self, have Uraraka practice her quirk using other parts of her body. The battle had thinned considerably now. Jiro, Shoji, Siro, Ojiro, Kaminari, Kirishima, Sato, Koda, Ida, Ashido, Aoyama, and Yaoyorozu all down for the count. Across the field Bakugo and Todoroki still had their sights set on each other, a terrible clash of technique and pure, brute force. Izuku heard a familiar high-pitched scream and turned just in time to spot Tsuyu slamming Mineta into the ground with her tongue, Tokoyami just a step behind her as Dark Shadow finished taking out Uraraka. For just a moment he looked posed to attack Tsuyu next, and then hesitated. They both trained eyes on him instead. "We're not allowed to team up," Izuku reminded them, and Tsuyu tilted her head consideringly. "We're not," she said, even as she, Tokoyami, and Dark Shadow all rushed him head-on. "Fine. Take a moment. Breathe. Smile." The field was now strewn with all manner of things, from Mineta's remaining balls to a host of small objects that Yaoyorozu had managed to summon in the first few minutes. Hardly knowing why he did it, Izuku bent and took hold of a long strip of Siro's tape, left on the grass after an unsuccessful binding attempt. He didn't know what he intended to do with it until it was already happening, his body following a series of movements he'd only seen once before and without his conscious mind making the decision to do so. It was for the best actually. If he had been able to think, he would have just panicked and not done it at all. Especially with Aizawa watching. Because though Siro's tape didn't have the same weight as a capture weapon, it still had enough heft to soar through the air. And though Izuku didn't have his teacher's training, he could jump a whole lot higher. Which meant that when all three of them were in the air, there was just a little bit of USJ history repeating itself. Izuku got one half of the tape wrapped around Tokoyami's waist, the other around Tsuyu's extended tongue, crisscrossed the section in the middle, and pulled as he hurtled them back towards the ground. The crunch of bodies slamming together was oddly satisfying. Even if it was his friends. 2 more down. 2 to go. Midoriya. It was Todoroki calling him now, Bakugo hot on his heels. Literally. Izuku didn't know how long they'd been fighting. It felt long though, and he knew, without a doubt, that he couldn't sustain one for all much longer. If those two hadn't worn each other out enough, he didn't stand a chance. As if to challenge the very notion that he'd ever wear down, Bakugo blasted ahead with a manic look in his eyes. He landed yards closer and began sprinting the rest of the way. Todoroki's expression hardened and he raised his hand to send out another coating of ice. That suddenly lifted off the ground. Izuku didn't have time to contemplate when Todoroki had started shooting ice projectiles because the next second he was pulling in Uraraka and tripping over something he couldn't see. Later while reviewing the tapes it would be so obvious that they'd both tumbled over an unconscious Hagakure, but right then all he could do was let out an undignified squawk. Luckily, his fall was the only thing that kept Todoroki's ice from impaling his shoulder, from getting blasted away by Bakugo's fire. Luck is as much a part of battle as skill, Aizawa had said. Use it. So Izuku used it. On the ground now with one as most powerful fighters bearing down on him. Seconds until they were here. Izuku knew based on those attacks alone that he couldn't take them, but perhaps he didn't need to. His fall had skid him to the very edge of the field's barrier, that malleable shield that would literally push someone back into the game because it had a soft, gelatinous texture. One could just sink their fingers into it, grab a handful and hold on. With one hand Izuku did just that. With the other he let what was left of one for all flow down into his middle finger and thumb. He pressed them hard against the dirt, and flicked. The resulting tremor was far more than what had occurred when Bakugo and Todoroki first clashed. Later he'd hear that the rest of UA's campus had thought that it was an earthquake. As it was, Izuku just had time to catch the wonderful look on Todoroki's face before he fell. Him and Bakugo both lost among the debris as an entire field crumbled beneath their feet. The fight ended with Izuku hanging on by just a thread. But then, sometimes a thread was all you needed. Points for creativity. Yes, sensei. Minus points for breaking your fingers again. Yes, sensei. Don't ever try one of my moves until I've shown it to you properly. You could have broken your neck. Or theirs. More likely theirs. Oh, yes, sensei. Quit saying, yes, sensei, you're giving me a headache. Yes, young. The rest of 1A laughed as Izuku slapped a hand over his mouth, cowering under Aizawa's glare. They were in high spirits considering they just lost and now sported varying injuries. In fact, for once Izuku was the least injured out of them all, and that produced a strangely good feeling inside him. Not quite as good as the happy thumbs up All Might flashed him as he passed by the classroom, grinning ear to ear and doing some dorky victory dance. But close. What's in a name? If asked, Izuku would have said he'd given it more thought than the average middle schooler, the proof in all the scribblings he'd done in past journals. Because even as a toddler it hadn't escaped his notice just how important a name was to a hero's identity and how many aspects there were to consider. It had to be catchy, of course, something that was easily remembered and tumbled nicely off the tongue, but that was just the tip of a rather massive iceberg, wasn't it? Did your name fit well into the established agencies? Did it remind civilians of any previous heroes? Or worse, their villains? It had to be something you'd never want to change and something the rest of the world was willing to accept. More than once Izuku had watched new heroes announce who they were only to find the next day that the media had other plans. It always made him a little sad. Surely they should be able to choose their names, of all things? Then again, it wasn't like Izuku had chosen his. That had been a gift from his mom. Then again, maybe hero names were the perfect second chance. A privilege for doing the impossible. How close was your hero name to your real name, anyway? When did your hero name become your real name? It was a question that only occurred to Izuku 10 months into his own delve into the impossible, when he stood on a beach and accidentally yelled the words, All Might, for half the world to hear. In his mind the skinny man with sunken eyes and a rather different kind of smile was All Might, just like the massive man with sparkling teeth and a booming voice was also All Might. It made sense to Izuku in a way that it couldn't, perhaps wouldn't, make sense to everyone else, yet that was the day he realized that names could also be something dangerous, wielded as unwitting weapons. The man's eyes had been extra kind an hour later. You should just call me Yagi, my boy. Or Tashinori, if you prefer. Too much, so much until Izuku felt like his brain was overloading, heat rising high on his cheeks and the man coughing blood in shock, waving a desperate hand to try and comfort him. Good luck with that, because even if he could get over the shock of a true name gifted alongside a true form, something Izuku had often imagined as a child, the image of All Might leaning close to whisper such secrets into his ear, the logistics were already racing through his mind. That danger again. All Might could mistakenly become Yagi on Izuku's lips, said in some moment of panic. Or Yagi could become All Might in the peace of Yue's halls, drawing the sort of attention that neither of them needed. And in the end separating the two just seemed cruel. All Might was Yagi and Yagi was All Might. How was Izuku supposed to choose between them? He settled on a generic sir that brought a blush to the man's cheeks, not dissimilar to his own. After that, Izuku hadn't expected names to follow him into Yue, a surprisingly relevant concern as he learned one after another. Ida and Uraraka and Ashido made things nice and simple for a while, until Tsuyu decided that the best time for intimacy was minutes before they all died. Although, if not then, he'd struggled with that, firmly ignoring Uraraka's teasing that he could call her Achiko if he really wanted, and instead set his sights on the drama caused by his own name, moving from Izuku to Deku and worrying about when he'd know that he'd actually succeeded in reclaiming something. If he ever would. It meant that Izuku yelled "Kaken" across the classroom not as some sort of revenge, but because that's just what kept pouring out of his mouth. 10-year-old habits were very hard to break. And it took Izuku another 3 months to realize that of course it would be the same for Kaken himself. The way he said Dekuch now was not necessarily the same voice as the one from their youth. Idiot. So Izuku put that word on his whiteboard, confident that this hero name was his own and no one could take that from him. Not easily. Gran Torino's smile when he heard it was enough to solidify his resolve and kickstart his adrenaline to boot. Nearly a year in then, and Izuku was older, maybe wiser, certainly smart enough now to realize that names were a messy, complicated part of his life that was never going to quite make sense. Koda's name wasn't a sound but rather a unassuming gesture up near his heart. Momo hated hers, so the use of Yaoyorozu became something else entirely, more gentle and kind. Ida had pride and shoji indifference, and for a long while Izuku wondered who Mike was on campus until he realized that Yamada-sensei was working through this just like the rest of them. Aizawa was something else, helping Izuku drag boxes into the dorm. I appreciate the respect, he'd said, not looking his way. But we've fought together. You can drop the sensei if you want. It took a while, but he had. Aizawa never did drop problem child though. Just like another teacher refused to give up Prince of Nonsense, and Izuku realized that sometimes you just had to resign yourself to the names that made other people happy. A strange ride all round. The sort of thing that a younger Izuku would have never considered. Then again, he never thought he'd be All Might's successor either. So, funny that Midoriya, Todoroki had said, previously a stranger and a rival, now out grocery shopping with him on a Saturday afternoon. Izuku made a happy hum to show he was listening. Behind him Todoroki was oddly quiet. Even for him. When he finally spoke his voice could hardly be heard over the din of the other shoppers. Call me Shoto. It was a question disguised as an order. Maybe even a plea. Izuku was grateful for his semi-privacy, smile falling as he considered names and choices. Why Todoroki in particular might not want the world to know him by his last name. When he turned, Izuku's smile would have rivaled a man with 2 names of his own. Sure, Shoto. And if you want you can use Izuku? He did want, and he did. In time. Names changed after all, messy and complicated and sometimes a little silly, but the good thing was, people changed along with them.